It's basically
Hey, Richie, as long as I don't like I just want to watch.
a couple of these.
That red blinking light in the top right, and the microphone's the one in the bottom right.
And the mic's on. Okay, perfect. Thank
And I think what happens is that number one thing was on the restaurant and it's kind of
Okay.
it's
I'll stop by after this.
I ran into Katie Spicer in the residence the other day, man. I heard she's going back to summer, she said.
She's been working.
A little bit here and there.
Yeah, because she's still putting on her sheets. Because she knows it.
That's right. I mean, whatever it takes to keep her, keep that, so we can hand it off, or she doesn't ever want to give it up, whatever. But
Yeah, she's been doing this and that.
that's her little baby, so.
We got
I'll do the higher part of that person back there. Okay. That's a lot to consume. Please. You know how I feel about that?
Yeah, I mean,
I think it's still up to you, understand a little bit, but it's.
it is, but.
It's Katie though, for her, she built a relationship with all the leagues and the players for a long time, and that's the hardest part,
I
right?
think she keeps it, because she knows it, it's,
Makes her feel good too, she really.
yeah. So she does a good little thing, we just kind of let her do it, she likes it, she loves it.
I bet she puts 4 hours into it.
But it's,
Yeah, good. Yep, I like it.
And this is food related. Yeah.
So Jake, boundaries, how much longer?
Yeah, that lasts 4 hours.
And then if you
That's marketing, say everything has to be marketed. So that it would not be valid.
Yes.
is there anything mic over and hold the bottom button?
Thank you for everything.
The flash.
Or why not flash?
Can they just press it then? Oh.
So underneath.
Here we go. Mine works. Is mine working? Green is good, right? Yeah, that works. Okay.
It depends on the sender.
Okay. Green is good. All right. Go ahead and get started, folks. You're ready. You got it. That's good.
Yeah, coming.
Green.
Yeah, he's running late, he said.
Oh, okay. All right.
Council, we do have coffee and
Pastries.
Thanks very much.
Upstairs or?
Thank you.
I just put it in for. Say
All right, ready to go then? Or Matt, do you want to do anything?
Yeah, we can do it. If I could go to the lane.
Good morning. Can y'all hear me okay? Thank you so much for having Frank and I here so early this morning. So we will start by quickly reviewing the zoning ordinance update process. I will mention the goal for today's meeting. I will give a very brief recap of the discussion that we had on May 13th, and then we will dig into the meat of the discussion. And we'll be noting major changes from the existing ordinance and diving into several specific topics as well. And then we will end with the next steps. As most of you know, I view this presentation as a discussion. Please interrupt, ask questions, or to add to the conversation at any time. The zoning and subdivision ordinance update is progressing in roughly 4 phases. The first phase included an analysis of the existing conditions in the city, as well as a thorough examination of both your existing zoning and subdivision ordinances. At the end of that phase, we produced a diagnostic report, which is available on the city's website. Phase 2 included creating the revised regulations. The major changes to your current code were fleshed out, and we concluded Phase 2 in September of 2023. All of the Phase 2 drafts were compiled into one document, and they're available on the city's website. The Phase 2 draft shows how the updated regulations differ from the city's existing regulations. Phase 3 began in January of this year. On January the 11th, we provided a draft of all of the proposed amendments. The Phase 3 draft actually tracks changes from the Phase 2 draft, and then Phase 3 ended in April. This Phase 3 draft is on the city's website as well. We are currently in Phase 4, and on May 6th, we delivered the first edition of the Phase 4 draft. And Phase 4 includes the adoption process, and we will deliver a second edition of the Phase 4 draft on or about June 28th. So our goal for today really is a deep dive into the proposed Unified Development Ordinance. We will be touching on those major changes and providing an overview of the major components of the zoning ordinance in particular. If you don't mind, we'll spend a few minutes briefly recapping what we talked about on May 14th. This recap will include the changes you proposed to the Phase 4 draft, as well as those topics that will be discussed with the Planning Commission on June 19th. In May, we dove into Article 1, which is the article of the Zoning and Subdivision Ordinance that includes all the provisions for administering the zoning ordinance and the subdivision ordinance. During this discussion, you asked that the appeals from the Design Review Board that are not related to certificates of appropriateness come to council before they go to circuit court. This change will be reflected in the next edition of the Phase 4 draft. After discussing the administrative provisions, we moved on to Article 3, which is the article that includes all of the zoning districts in UDO.
Can you go back to the last one real quick?
Yes, sir.
So we said that by design review, appeals go to the council. Okay, never mind. I just want to make sure I don't miss anything to the council.
Yeah, it comes to you before it goes to. And as I said, the next edition of the Phase 4 draft, this will be reflected.
Okay.
Oops. In Article 3, we had discussions about we reviewed the structure of the proposed zoning ordinance, and then we looked at the general revisions to the zoning districts themselves. At the conclusion of that discussion, you asked to prohibit hotels in all non-residential zoning districts. And again, that will be shown in the next edition of the Phase 4 draft.
Didn't we propose hotels in no districts? Not just non-residential, so that means all the CBD districts, all that. Is that correct?
Essentially, hotels will be prohibited everywhere in the city because they were not considered to be appropriate within the residential.
My brain hasn't woken up yet, so I'm missing every other word, so I apologize.
Not a problem. We spent a lot of time talking about the permitted uses and standards for the R1 and R2 districts. As you recall, the R1 districts are your single-family districts, and the R2 is your two-family district. At that time, if I understood correctly, you asked to discuss with the Planning Commission 2 particular topics as it relates to two-family dwellings. You asked whether or not it was appropriate to add square footage to an existing two-family where it exists today for things like adding a bathroom, so that the two-family may become more usable. You also asked to discuss with them whether or not it was appropriate to replace an existing two-family dwelling with a new two-family dwelling. Did I encapsulate the discussion correctly? And are these the questions that you want to discuss with the Planning Commission in a couple of weeks?
I think that, Danny, you kind of brought that up, right? We should start these at 9.
Yeah. Do you have a phone?
I'm still thinking about the last change, sorry.
That's what I keep doing too. We're moving fast in a second.
Anything else we want to talk to the Planning Commission about?
Yes.
This is correct? Okay.
I like this suggestion, honestly.
Is there anything you want to discuss today prior to a talk with the Planning Commission, or is there anything specific?
Not that I
Have
can
you,
think
have
of.
we could
Just that-
research to kind of help
Yeah.
with the discussions, is there anything?
I think once you get into the setbacks of the property are going to restrict the amount of square footage.
Correct.
So you're not going to go past that. Correct?
Correct, unless you go to BOA,
Right.
Board of Adjustment.
So that will limit the square footage, but it's not going to limit the fact that you're going to have an extra bedroom.
Correct. So right now, as it's currently drafted, you could, that become a restricted use, it becomes permitted, but you could not add on to it.
Right.
For the Alexandria Pike mixed-use district, we talked about this in great depth, particularly the type of desired density and intensity throughout the district. After this discussion, you requested to talk to the Planning Commission about limiting the number of stories in a building and the appropriateness of residential over non-residential. Are there any other topics that you want to add to this list to talk to the Planning Commission about in terms of Alexandria Pike?
Did we want to discuss more? Do we want to send a suggestion or just have the discussion? They had the discussion already, right? Correct? Did they have?
So they have had a discussion about the appropriateness of residential over non-residential several times. Truthfully, they punted the issue of limiting the number of stories to y'all. So that would be a good discussion for y'all to have
So
together.
I was kind of thinking, so.
Could we also add width of building?
Sure.
Well, we use 50 as it stands, right?
So there is no maximum width in the Alexandria Pike mixed-use district as it's currently drafted.
There's 150 in the CBD, right?
In the CBD, yes.
So there isn't anything in that particular. Yeah, last time the discussion, I think it had basically 2 or 3 stories, perhaps 2 stories of commercial, 1 story residential. Is that what it was?
We were sort of all over the map, to be honest with you. I mean, there was a discussion about having no residential over non-residential. There was saying, you know,
Which is how originally it was, right?
what do you mean
It
by
was all
original?
commercial. There was no residential originally. Now Alexandria Pike.
So as of today, Alexandria Pike has 2 districts, professional office and general commercial. And today, residential over non-residential is permitted by right in both of those zoning
Yeah, it
districts.
changed in what, 20?
And professional office has allowed residential over non-residential at least since 2012. The general commercial happened in 2018, 2019, so fairly recently. So I will add maximum building width to that discussion with the Planning Commission.
Well, are we going to send it back to them? Are we going to punt it again? It seems like they wanted some direction on that.
Well, y'all are going to meet together on the 19th.
Okay.
And so what if it's okay with y'all, I will raise these issues and then, for example, say, here are some ways that you can address these concerns. If you think that it's appropriate to have residential over non-residential, how is it appropriate? It could be as a conditional use, but not by right. I mean, those types of things will be a part of the discussion to help seed y'all's discussion.
I have been thinking about this one quite a bit. You know, I think that one of the major concerns for people around here is some of this discussion. I think that it would be prudent if you give, you know, perhaps what at least one of us is thinking. I definitely like the 2 stories a lot. I am concerned on width, and lately we've been getting a lot of, not a lot, but there's definitely been some chatter. We had one last week on scooters, traffic in town, bikes. So I think safety is a concern. So I think for me, people like the city the way it is. We are getting, it seems like our population is growing a little bit. We have a lot more congestion. And the more things we have, the more traffic we have, it takes away from the safety, which we're always number 1 or number 2 in the state. So I think that safety has to be a big concern and the quality of life that comes with that, you know. So where's the balance, you know, whether we want to edit, what's the proper balance? And I think that one thing that we kept talking about last time is that none of the stuff is, you know, there's no set in stone. If someone comes with a good design, a good plan, they can always adjust as they go along, right? So these are guidelines, but somebody can always propose something to planning and zoning, it comes back to council to change it, correct?
No.
It's not, we can change zoning anytime.
You can change zoning anytime you want.
Sure.
But as you just mentioned, the residential and the non-residential and general commercial happened recently, and y'all didn't realize when you did that it wasn't just limited for that one site. It was for the entire zoning district. So yes, you can change zoning anytime, But you're not going to be able to limit it to that particular site. It would
Unless we
change
create a new zone.
unless you create a new zone.
So it is possible.
It is possible, but it's not as if someone can just come in with a plan and say, this is what I want to do, and y'all can just easily change zoning based on that plan. If you do that, it has rippling effects wherever else you have that zoning district,
Unless we create a new zone.
unless you create a new zone.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you can always change zoning, that's your prerogative, but you need to understand what that means, and it's not just as simple as someone bringing you a plan.
Yeah, I just think that I don't want to make sure how everybody else feels, but I feel that the 2 stories and the width really protect what we have now. It seems like we've done a couple surveys now with brand fuel and previous comprehensive plan. People like the way it is, and I think that we're getting a lot of density and stuff like that. And I get concerned with more traffic through town. So that would be my concern with it.
So we also discussed the neighborhood commercial office district, which is the non-residential district that is used in various locations throughout the city. Because the district is used in many different contexts, you asked to discuss the maximum permitted height in this district with the planning commission, as well, again, as the suitability of allowing residential over non-residential. Anything else I need to add to that discussion with them in 2 weeks?
Yes, we didn't get to talk about it, I brought it up at the last meeting, but why the neighborhood office doesn't include any of the density requirements that other zones require?
So we have not talked about it, frankly, and it doesn't, the general commercial and the professional office today just have a 2-to-1 ratio, and it has not been an issue or concern of the planning commission. So what was in place previously is essentially what's there now, so in this draft. So, I mean, that particular provision is gone as well. So we can add to the list, whether if you want to keep residential over non-residential, what density should it be? So I'll add that to the list.
On the neighborhood commercial office, also, just, we talked about it last time, and there's been some discussion in the community about how to bivouac.
Yes.
And so can you explain, I mean, I live right there too, and we're all familiar with it, and I don't think that there's any appetite to have some of the possibilities that could be in a quote-unquote neighborhood commercial office zone. Can you just recap a little bit how that particular area is zoned currently? If it stays in, what the options are? I mean, it doesn't have to say neighborhood commercial office, I would think.
It has to be zoned something.
It does, right?
So it's currently zoned professional office.
Yeah.
It is neighborhood commercial office. All the uses that are objectionable, fueling stations and drive-throughs, all of those things, all of those vehicle-related uses are conditional uses and in the neighborhood commercial office district, and have minimum lot areas that are much greater than what is permitted than that site. So that site's a little more than half an acre.
Right.
And so, for example, a drive-through has to have an acre. That's its requirement in the conditional use. So therefore, it can't go there. The vehicle sales has to have a minimum lot area of 2.5 acres. So it can't go there. So to answer your question, we have used both the conditional uses and the restricted use restrictions to tightly limit what can go at the top of bivouac. So that's how that's being done. So while it is definitely in the same zoning district, it is those standards that are precluding the objectionable uses from going there.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I want to dig into the specific language a little bit more before we meet with the planning commission in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Just because that's a very unique area. I mean, it's much different than some of the other neighborhood commercial office zones. And the current use is obviously unique to that area too, so I understand that. It's, it's got a house on one side and then it's literally on the corner of a residential street.
Right. But that is how we're doing it. So for example,
What's the height and width restriction there?
so the height is it's currently 50 feet. In your existing ordinance, it's 50 feet. And in the neighborhood commercial office, it's 50 feet. But y'all asked to have a discussion about that with the planning commission to perhaps reduce the height. So that will be it. when you say you want to talk about it a little more, do you want to talk about it with me? Do you want to how do you want to handle sort of digging into those
Yeah, I can
restrictions?
talk about it with you, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, just some of the conditional uses that you're referring to, I just want to kind of make sure I fully understand that.
Okay.
As far as one of the, this might answer something too. In the, like Alexandria Pike District, just like the R3 and R5, it has, you've added maximum residential density, which is figured out by, you can have 4 units, the first 8,000 square feet, and then it's, you need an additional 4,000 square feet per additional unit.
Right.
So, and what I was kind of getting at is in the neighborhood commercial office district, it isn't in here.
No, it is not.
So should we be adding something like that in there?
So that would be, I mean, I think the first question to have with the planning commission is, do you want to permit residential over non-residential? If the answer is no,
And you don't need to
then
worry.
you don't need to worry about it. If the answer is yes, then we need to talk about what that density is. It could be a density limit. It could be a ratio limit like you currently have. I mean, there are any number of ways to skin that cat. The other thing you can do, but as Ben just said, I mean, that's the one district that is used sporadically throughout town, right? And so there may be places where you think residential over non-residential is appropriate. For example, and I'm not suggesting this, I'm just giving you an example, Fort Thomas Plaza. But it's not appropriate at the top of Bivouac, and it's not appropriate at the 2 sites in Memorial. So you can make it a conditional use. And as a part of the conditional use, you can have standards that are density related. There are a number of ways to skin that cat if you choose to do it. And I'll add that to the discussions for in 2 weeks with the planning commission. So it doesn't have, the point of that very long explanations, it doesn't have to be all or nothing.
Should we have, I'm glad Ben brought that up. I didn't know when we were talking about that. Should we hit, he wants to meet with me. Should we talk about it as a whole now, since we're all here, to give some direction to planning commission, maybe even if there's a general direction on what we're thinking and what we'd like in those areas versus just hunting it again instead of going back and forth?
I mean, you're all going to meet together, and I think I'm more than happy to do what y'all want, what you want to do. But I think there is a way to have this discussion where we talk about what the options are.
Okay.
Like I was just saying, like you could say, for example, residential over non-residential is appropriate at Fort Thomas Plaza, but not in these other places.
Okay.
So we make it a conditional use. I think that's a discussion you want to have with the planning commission, so you all have the same set of information at the same time.
I just was trying to figure out a way to hone it in, because if we keep putting or keep going back and forth, this is going to go on forever, right? So I think,
I will try to facilitate that discussion so that all the issues are laid out and all of the options are laid out as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is it okay if I move on? So we reviewed both the historic overlay districts, which includes the Central Business District Historic Overlay District and the Tower Park Historic Overlay District. We discussed at length the neighborhoods that are in the proposed Tower Park Historic Overlay District, as well as the restrictions currently governing alterations to the residential parcels in Tower Park. After this discussion, you advised to retain Main Street in proposed Tower Park Historic Overlay District.
Have you had any more discussion within that?
Yeah, just to follow up, Tim and I and Wes we're planning on meeting with Green Street HOA in June. We're still working out a couple dates, but we've been talking with them just to meet with them. I had a good talk with them after this last meeting. I guess it was a council meeting about it. So I think we're on a good path.
Yeah, I met with a few of them, and I can understand some of the concerns. I'm not sure how much it moves the needle, but I can understand your concerns for sure. Are you going to invite any council members to be there at this meeting or not? Is it just going to be between you guys?
Probably the initial one, we kind of talked, we're not going to have everybody there.
Yeah.
I think the initial just to kind of see where they're at, because I think we're getting to a better place with them.
Yeah,
And then
I want them to feel comfortable too,
Right.
right? If we're there, it makes
So I think the first one,
makes the room
and-
a lot different too.
Right.
So
yeah, and if we need follow-up, by all means, but I'll give council, just so you know, I'll give you guys a recap after that meeting, just to know what we talked about and the steps forward on that.
just so you know, I feel how I just want to let you know how I feel. I think it's appropriate that.
Put your mic on.
Oh yeah, so the public knows that I'd really like to propose changes you have made to the overlay for the entire area. I understand their concerns. I think some of them are valid. I don't know how much they move the needle, but if they have something, I'd like to hear it, you know what I mean? But I did like the thought of all three being under the umbrella as long as, you know, it doesn't affect them too much other than having to see a different individual versus themselves, you know what I mean? It's a very unique area.
After we discussed the location for the Fort Thomas Avenue Overlay District proposed regulations as well, we reviewed, you asked to review the homes on corner lots to determine if they should be included in the proposed overlay district. Later in the presentation, we will look at photos of those homes on those lots to determine whether or not you want to include them. So before we move on to today's discussions, is there anything else you would like to discuss from the council retreat in May? Gone. Anything else?
I'm sorry, I was still in my head on last one. Review the homes of the corner lots. Oh yeah, so they what did we decide on that? The ones that don't face the street, this is what you're talking about, the ones that don't actually face.
Right.
And there's only a handful of them, right?
Get your microphone.
Oh yeah.
Sorry, no, you're right. So I have to keep turning on and off. So I think Councilman Strange has made up a good point. There's only a handful of them, right? And some of them do have big side porches, right? So they would technically be allowed to put solar panels.
So later on in the presentation, I'm going to show you all of those lots with photographs of them. And then y'all can have a discussion about whether or not.
I thought the discussion was supposed to be now. Cool.
No. So we're going to do, I have photographs of all of them. So that'll be later on. All right, so Article 3 includes all of the individual zoning districts, and this morning we will spend most of our time discussing the traditional business district, which is Inverness, the central business district for both Town Center and Midway, and then we will just conclude our discussions in Article 3 with the Fort Thomas Avenue Overlay District in terms of those corner lots. I will spend just a few seconds quickly reviewing all of the zoning districts in the proposed UDO just to give you some context. On the screen, you see the residential districts. All of the existing residential districts are being retained in the UDO, including the 5 single-family, the 1 2-family, and the 2 multifamily districts. And then there is the 1 additional single-family district, which is the R1 Town Center district that we discussed last month. There are 4 mixed-use and business districts, which includes the central business district with all of the corresponding subzoning districts that we will be discussing in depth in just a minute. The traditional business district, which as I said is Inverness, the Alexandria Pike mixed-use district, and the neighborhood commercial office district. There are 2 other districts, which are the River Preservation District, which is along Route 8 of Mary Ingalls Highway, and the Conservation District. Currently, there is 1 parcel in the city's zone conservation district, and that is located at the back of a multifamily development that is at where both Waterworks Road and Taylor Avenue meet. So at the very back of that parcel is conservation. There are 4 special districts, which in Fort Thomas happen to all the overlay districts. They are the residential cluster overlay district, which is the only existing overlay that you have, and that is being retained. The others are new, and they are the Fort Thomas Avenue overlay and the 2 historic districts that we discussed last month. So we're going to move on to Inverness. Today, it is zoned general commercial. The traditional business district is shown in the map on the screen in sky blue. You will notice that there is a red line in front of some of the parcels. This red line denotes that these frontages must have required occupied space, which is defined in the UDO as active building spaces, meaning spaces where people are actively occupying it during the day. So it can't be, for example, a storage room. The reason that we do that is because those are frontages that we think are important, and we want it to enliven the public realm. So we're specifically saying you have to have a public space of some sort there.
And that's like Smitty's, the old ones across the river, Tickle Pickle, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, we're talking about Tickle Pickle, the old Smitty's, and then the gas station. So if that site ever redevelops, and you will notice that that line does not turn the corner onto Fort Thomas Avenue. It is just simply the frontage along Memorial Parkway.
Or the going down North Fort Thomas to the north of those residential houses currently? There's 3 parcels there.
Yeah, so those are residential parcels currently,
Is there a reason we have them inside the traditional business district?
because they are today. Today, they're zoned general commercial. And so there's a discussion with the planning commission about whether or not to retain them in the traditional business district or to let them go.
They would be non-conforming as they sit now, right?
Today, they are non-conforming with the exception of the one parcel on the west side of the street that is an insurance agency, I believe, today, which is a house.
That little skinny line right there next to it. What's the deal passing with all just the lines to them?
So that is actually how the physical zoning map looks for the Fort Thomas Avenue overlay.
But that don't mean anything?
Right now, we're just talking, I just took an excerpt from the zoning map to show to you. And so it just happens to be that in order to capture everything that was zoned to traditional business district, I had to get in some of the portion of the parcels that are in the Fort Thomas Avenue overlay. But the hatching, that's what that denotes.
So back to the 3
Yeah.
parcels that are residences, are we going to discuss those with the planning and zoning committee to potentially move those to residential, or do we have to have some kind of a buffer between the TBD and residential?
So we certainly can add to the list of discussion items whether or not to retain them. Right now, they're non-conforming in terms of use. So we are saying that they are conforming if they exist today as a residential property. So that change is happening as a part of the traditional business district. So they go from being non-conforming uses to conforming uses with one exception. I understand that one of those parcels is actually being used as a 3-family, and that is not a restricted use in the traditional business district. Just a 2-family is. So that one will continue to be non-conforming.
If we were to move those to a different zone, what's the typical path to do that? Do we contact the property owners and have them part of the discussion, or?
So the only thing I would say is this. So the parcel that's on the east side, right there at Rob and White, the one that currently has or used to have the barber in it. If you make those parcels residential, if that parcel is ever to redevelop, where Smitty's is, you're going to constrain redevelopment on it because there's going to be a buffering requirement between that non-residential parcel and the residential parcel next door.
But the buffering requirement is going to be somewhere down that line.
It will be. It will be. I mean, if you would like to have a discussion with the planning commission, we can. You can either do one of 2 things. You can invite them to that discussion, or they'll get a notice in the mail. I mean, they're going to get a notice in the mail anyway because they're going to go from general commercial to traditional business. But they would get a notice in the mail that they are suddenly, and this is the other thing you need to keep in mind, is that you are taking away, to a certain extent, the value of their property when you take them from a commercial zoning to a residential one. And so that would be a discussion that they would want to be a part of. The change from general commercial to traditional business district is immaterial in terms of the value of the property.
I thought it'd be the other way around, because if they're non-conforming now, you would think that they would want to be conforming if something were to happen to their property.
And we're going to make them conforming as a part of this.
Okay.
They are, with the one exception that I believe is in 3-family.
Okay.
I would want to send it.
And certainly we could make those conforming if you chose to do so, but that was not a discussion with the planning commission. That was not something they wanted to do, was to take it the next step and suddenly make the 3 families that are in town conforming.
Understood. Okay, thank you.
Those are tough ones to develop too.
Residential bubble. I'm trying to picture some of these buildings as many times as I drive by, but these all just have to be business. They cannot have residential bubble.
So they can in the traditional business district. They can have residential above.
Okay.
2 of them already do, right? 2 or 3 already do.
So the building on the corner of Rob Roy and Fort Thomas Avenue have residential above. There's residential above the building where the Smitty's used to be, or Smitty's is. There's residential there. Where it goes from blue to pink, that parcel there that has a hair salon in it, has residential above. So with the exception of the gas station, they all do.
Isn't Smitty's a part of the balloon across the river?
They do separate.
Yeah.
So the next, I'm looking at it on the map, so 914 would be that first residential house past going north with the lot that has like the axe shape at the end of it.
There's access from Rockaway. Those are unusual houses too, because the hills.
What address if you could set?
914.
Find hard to believe it.
914 North Fort Thomas?
Yeah.
And what's the question, sorry?
That is a residence. It's not-
Yes, yeah, I mean, right next door to Smitty's is a residence.
Yeah. I thought you said that Smitty's building is separate, but that's what I thought.
No. So there are 3 residential dwellings on North Fort Thomas on the other side of Smitty's. Across the other street, next to Tickle Pickle, there is the insurance agent. I'm sorry? I don't think I can do that.
That's pretty fun. Told me the same.
Anything else about,
Yeah, you noted that at the gas station, that it doesn't turn the corner onto North Fort Thomas.
Correct.
Standard. Why is that? Why wouldn't that be consistent?
because you are creating a business environment in that corner. When you take the turn onto North Fort Thomas, it becomes decidedly more residential. And so if they wanted an inactive space there, that would be consistent with having a sort of a buffer as you become more residential.
This area right here, these two areas, this and this, these are those parks or the parks in front of it?
Those are parks.
Those are both parks,
This is a park and this is a park?
correct.
The city owns those, right? So there's no chance of those changing. Do we rezone park areas as parks or not? Is that not how that works?
So some communities create a zoning district called open space for all the land that they own, or that's owned by the school district or whatever else is park, and they just zone it that way. That's not a choice y'all have ever made. Today it's zoned general commercial, and so it's being zoned that way. It's commercial business now.
I think it might behoove us to consider zoning them for open space that way, because as of right now, I guess I don't think the city would ever sell them, right? But that would.
So that's certainly,
Is it more common than not? What do you see as more change? Or is it?
it runs the gamut. Most places don't have an open space district. Truthfully, that was something that happened 20 or 30 years ago, much more commonly than it does now.
Okay.
If you would like to do that, we certainly can, but it would then.
How does that affect things? How does that change things?
Practically, or just in this whole exercise?
Just practical.
Practically, nothing. I mean, the only issue would be if you chose to sell it, you would then have whomever bought it would have to rezone it. But if you own the property, I wouldn't be particularly worried that it's zoned something else. I mean, it's zoned traditional business. But if you want to create the open space district, we need to know that. That's gonna be.
It was just a thought, just because we have a lot of pocket parks in town, and some of them are like in commercial areas. I just don't know that if someone's reading it from a map and not coming through, not that they would never come through it, if that's appealing to them or not, or if they think they're going to come in and get more space and all of a sudden see a park there that they don't get. I don't know. It's kind of nice to have park space on maps. In my personal opinions, I think people love that about our city, but I just don't know how much it would really affect. Has anybody feel one way or the other about that?
Limit us, like say we want to redo that area at some point, I'm not saying that we would, but would that limit us on what you can really do to make that a even more open space down the road?
No, I mean, if you wanted to create an open space zone and zone it that, no, it's not going to limit you. What it would limit you is at some point in the time you wanted to sell it, it would limit you. Or if, for example, you wanted to hold on to it, and because there are communities who do this, and redevelop that parcel into something that is business related and as a catalyst for something else. I don't see you doing that here, but that would be the only limitation.
I'm a big believer in keeping the park space as long as we can. So I wouldn't mind.
Yeah, just so you know, I mean, the one parcel is 0.07 acres, and then the other one's only a quarter. So
Sure, there's a lot of space like
Yeah,
that.
there is.
I like the thought of just a protective overlay on myself. How's anybody else feel about that? Anybody?
Yeah, but
Bueller?
Seems to be like practically, it doesn't matter, really it doesn't matter. I mean, I'm hesitant to really overcomplicate it, because when you start to open that can, then you can look all over town, little tiny, quarter or less acre spots that have some green space, and I mean,
Fuck.
I feel like they're sufficiently protected now.
That's all. I just want to protect them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? People love them. You know what I mean? That's my goal is to protect the green spaces when people come here for parks, walking. I mean, if it's easy and it doesn't change anything, I don't see why not.
Should we discuss that with
I mean, I don't think it's something we need to discuss unless council's interested in selling.
I mean, I agree with it.
Good luck doing that.
We're not interested in that, so I don't know if the exercise is.
We can't afford Max to do
Worth
our
our
work,
words.
get rid of somebody. So, I mean, I can't see.
I agree with that. As long as we own the property,
And we,
we
and
can always do something.
right, and we do have a lot of little parcels scattered throughout the city, so council aware is, I mean, that would be a pretty big exercise to designate each one of them that, I mean, it's something we'd look at in the future, but I wouldn't stall us out.
I just think I think people value the green space, so I just think it's nice to.
Sure.
How does that work practically? It's really, the 30 seconds on it. The city wanted to sell one of these pieces. Does it come through council? What's the process?
Absolutely, you would have to approve any sale, council would approve any sale.
It's also on an auction too, isn't it? It's not.
It doesn't have to be, if it's for economic development, it doesn't have to be, but yes, it usually does.
And even if it was changed, they could say change it back if they need to sell it regardless, so.
Yeah, right, it's 2 votes to change it to whatever we want, just as like it's 2 votes to sell it.
Matt, I would agree with you that this could be something that we could discuss later, but I don't know why we need to.
Okay. Move on.
So unlike the general commercial zoning that is currently there, the traditional business district has defined development standards that reinforce the existing built environment and provide appropriate development standards, for example, with the gas station redevelopment develops. The minimum front setback along Fort Thomas is 0 with a maximum front setback of 10. And the maximum front setback can be increased by 10 feet if an outdoor amenity area like a plaza or a seating area is provided. Typical office and retail uses are permitted, as well as residential over non-residential uses. Prior to the council retreat in May, the Planning Commission removed hotels from the list of permitted uses.
Are we going to discuss the width? Is that something that's on feet up there? Is that going to be discussed in the combined meeting too? Are we discussing all of this and all the parcels?
So we're going to discuss the issue of the maximum building width in the central business district in just a few minutes.
No, I mean, this is the traditional
This is
business.
the traditional business
Right now,
district.
so
Yeah.
we can discuss the width here too as well.
Oh, it was not on the list of things to discuss. Do you want to discuss it?
I just think width in general is
So let's take a step back then. So if this parcel ever redevelops, the one that's where currently the gas station is, if you overly complicate redevelopment of that parcel, it's going to make it difficult to happen. So in very rare circumstances, you're going to hear me say what I'm going to say, which is I would not change that number for this area. For 2 reasons. One, that's probably consistent with what the existing building is right now for where Smitty's is. And you do not want to add so many development standards on that gas station parcel that it does not get redeveloped.
Is it to sit there and it's late? Is that
Correct.
the risk?
Correct.
What is, so I was trying to think of this on my drive through town today. What building is 150 feet wide? So I have a 155 feet versus 100 feet.
So if you give me just a few
Yeah, no,
seconds.
that's that. I need that.
I'm going to give you those exact, like, I'm going to give you the dimensions of this building when we get to that discussions. And we can, if we need to, we can come back and talk about it for this side as well. But I think you are going to overly complicate redevelopment if you put too much more restrictions on this site. Anything else about the traditional building business district?
Is that the only one? Is that the only traditional building?
It is. I only have. So we're moving on to the central business district for ease of discussion. I have split the discussion into 2, and we're going to start talking off by the town center or downtown, and then we'll discuss the midway in depth as well later on. So like the Alexandria Pike mixed use district, we are using sub-zoning districts to differentiate the areas in town center. In town center, we have 3 sub-zoning districts. There is the core, and I'll show you a map in just a second, the supporting, and the residential. So the pink is the town center core. So that's One Highland, the area across the street from it, all the way down to the City Hall building. The orangest, sort of light orange, is the supporting zoning district. And then the areas that are sort of that, I don't know, bluish color, dark bluish, those are the residential districts. And so we did this because your current CBD really treats all of this the same. It treats it in terms of uses. It treats it the same in terms of development standards. So we are doing this to really understand and respect your existing uses in this area. So again, you will see the red line for a portion of the town center, which is that is required to have applied occupied space. And then you will see the asterisks that are at the top of Highland. And we talked about last June that that is a terminated view. And so as a part of this rewrite, we are requiring enhanced architectural standards for a terminated view. And then finally, you will see the brown hash marks, and those hash marks show the area that is in the Central Business District Historic Overlay District. Any questions about this map before we move on? And you'll see excerpts from it as we move forward, but it's important to understand that our development standards and our uses are different depending upon which sub-zoning district you are in.
We move on, are we staying in this district?
Yes, we're staying on town center.
Yeah.
But any questions about the map in terms of what is in the core? And we had long discussions last year about what should be in the core, what should be in the supporting. Any questions about how that ultimately played out on the screen?
What's the definition of supporting?
So supporting is an area that's less intense. And so when we get to development standards, you will see what that means. So one of the major topics of conversation throughout the zoning ordinance update is the maximum permitted height in downtown. Today, the maximum permitted height is 50 feet throughout all of the Central Business District. When we talked in June of last year, we made the core, the maximum height is 40 feet, and the supporting is 35 feet. So that's one of the changes that's different between the core and the supporting currently as it's instructed. Since that time, we have heard concerns that 3 stories could potentially be built in 40 feet, and that is a concern for some community members. And they have asked to limit that to 2 stories. Other community members have said perhaps 2.5 stories is okay. And then other community members have said if you're going to limit the number of stories, then allow 40 feet in both the core and the supporting. And say 2 or 2.5. So there's a discussion that's sort of all over the board in terms of what's permitted. So the question becomes, the first question is, do you want to limit the number of stories?
It seems like the overall theme is no 3 stories. It seems like that's the overall theme.
I mean, is there a big difference between 2 and 2.5?
So look at the screen. So this graphic shows you how height is measured. It's measured from grade to the highest point of the roof and illustrates also a half story. So the Kaufman Realty building is 2.5 stories. So that gives you an idea of the difference between 2 and 2.5.
How tall is that one roughly?
So roughly it's 36 feet tall, but I gauged that using online sources. So, that's not going to be precisely right, but that's about what it is. It's about 36 feet.
The building across the street from that is probably taller.
So it is, and we'll talk about that when we get to when we get to Midway.
You brought these.
I know, it's my fault. But I was trying to give you a frame of reference as to what it was, and there was one in your community, so I used it. So, the first question is, do you want to limit the number of stories? Yes or no? And if so, is it 2 or 2.5?
Oh, yes. I like 2. I said it earlier. One thing real quick before I forget, Matt, when I was reviewing this, and thank you for saying the slideshow earlier, I don't know that I need the whole thing printed out, but what I was having trouble with was going back and reviewing, looking at what I had and going back and reviewing the districts. If we could have a printout of the actual districts, like the sub-districts, the maps, of the small area, so that when we're talking about this, I don't have to go back and review, so I can look at the areas. Does that make sense?
We mean the zoning map?
The zoning map, just a small version of the zoning map of the areas we're talking
You
about.
can't do a small map because you can't see anything. The PDF is really the best, so you can actually zoom in. Is that what you mean? Because
Well, like if you go back one, you go back one more, I guess, a couple more, right there.
Oh, you just mean these? Okay.
These, yeah, because if we're talking about these, right, there's 3 different districts, and they break it up. I don't know if anybody else, but that will help me
Yeah.
go back and look. I mean, I kind of reviewed it, and that was the only thing I was having trouble with when I was reviewing the slideshow. It just makes it a little bit, especially if we're talking about it as a whole here, instead of having to go back. Please.
Yes.
Alyssa, when it comes to the story conversation, can we focus on the CBD just for simplicity's sake? I'm thinking what's there currently, and like our office building, for example, or some of the homes between the Summit Lodge and Fifth Third Bank. Our office building, I think, is probably qualified as 2.5 stories, not 3. And I think that some of those homes, or maybe all of them, are 2.5 stories currently. They're not 2.
Correct.
Right?
I don't see a huge difference in a half story. It's not like you're gonna get, it's kind of restricted anywhere with the height and everything else, like you could probably do.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be restricted to either 35 or 40 feet, depending upon what y'all decide. And then the 2.5 just gives, you know, what you see on the screen.
I mean, if you restrict it to 35 feet, you essentially restrict it to 2.5. I mean, it'd be really tough to get.
Like I'm thinking that's like a, yeah.
And I talked to a couple of developers and, 35 feet really is, you're not going to get 3 stories.
You're never going to get 3 stories in 35 feet. I rarely say that, but you will never get 3 stories.
Personally, if you wanted to, it worked for whatever you were trying to do, and it's 3 stories, or 3 stories, but it's only 35 feet, I'm more worried about, personally, the height. Blocking out the sight lines and making it look like a slot canyon.
Like is it overkill to restrict it to be 2.5 for what they want to do on the.
So there are 2 issues here. We talked about a little bit with Alexandria Pike. It's the issue of the things that Eric's talking about in terms of how the height is perceived. And then there's the issue of density and intensity. So the idea of the concern behind allowing 3 stories and potentially 40 feet is that you would have more intensity on the site. So we're looking at both the issue of intensity as well as the height of the building in terms of how it relates to the right-of-way.
Does the 2.5 eliminate flat roofs?
There is nothing in the code as it's currently drafted that would prohibit a flat roof. If you allow 2.5 stories, people are probably going to go that route just because it can give them a little bit more floor area. But there is nothing in the code that prohibits a flat roof in the town center or in the midway.
Because the flat roof would look, at 35 feet, would look a whole heck of a lot different than this 35 feet.
It will. I'm trying to think of what you have that's flat.
But isn't it 3 stories at that point? If he's turning that Kaufman building into a flat roof at the peak of the roof, isn't it 3 stories?
Well, that point becomes 3 stories, yes. Did I misunderstand your question?
No.
Well,
It was,
we'll see.
yeah, you guys covered it.
So this is 2.5. If they would flatten that out,
It becomes 3
it
stories.
becomes 3
It
stories.
becomes
So
3
it
stories.
has to be the peak.
It has to be peaked in order to have that.
So that fixes
Yes.
that.
So again, we're talking about 2 different things. We're talking about the height as it's perceived from the right-of-way, which is what Eric was talking about. And then you're talking about intensity. How much floor area are you going to have on that site? And obviously 3 stories and 40 feet is more floor area and more intense use than 2.5.
So why don't we talk about both height and number of stories? I'm still thinking about CBD just for right here, just for sake of simplicity. You've got 2.5 story homes. Some of them, I don't know how tall they are. I'm thinking 35. They might be 30, might be 36 or 7. Like you said, that was probably 36.
This is about 36.
So what if we called it 35 feet, 2.5 stories? And if somebody for some odd reason wants to tear something down and rebuild there, they've got 35 feet, and if they needed another foot or 2 for architectural reasons, they would go to Board of Adjustment, right?
Correct, but it would be difficult.
But they couldn't add a 3rd story.
They could not add a 3rd story, but they could then ask for, 3 stories at that point. So because of the discussion that we're having, some community members have said, why don't you just make the whole of both the core and the supporting 40 feet and limit it to 2.5 stories? That way, you are handling both issues, right? You're allowing someone to have, because like this is about 36 feet, maybe higher, but you are then capping the amount of intensity that can be on the site. So that's where that came from. If you're going to limit the number of stories, perhaps you increase the height in the supporting.
Now, there's discussion about giving Kevin here a 10% leeway, a 10% decision-making power, so could he adjust that without going to a board and add 10% to the top of that?
So there are administrative modifications that are permitted for maximum height up to 10%. So for example, on a 40-foot building, it could be 4 feet.
Which would actually add a significant difference for what people want, what the person building wants.
But he could not add the maximum number of stories, right? You can't have a 10% of.
But if you have, if that 2.5 stories becomes essentially 3 stories, if you have 4 feet.
But again, you're talking about height, you're not talking about intensity. So we have to keep that distinction.
But it still becomes a 3rd story, that it becomes 4 feet taller enough, even though it says 2.5.
It still doesn't become a 3rd story. It still has to look like that
So it's at the peak.
at the peak. Because that's what that point of the graphic to the right is. You measure from the ground to the peak. You don't measure from the ground to the eave like most communities. Most communities don't do that.
So we're saying no flat roofs then?
There is nothing as it's currently drafted that would prohibit flat roofs.
I think 35 feet.
But it would prohibit 3 stories.
Yeah.
I'm
It would
sorry?
prohibit 3 stories.
It would prohibit 3 stories.
I mean,
I don't get it though, because if you add the flat roof and then you add 4 feet onto it, and even though it says 2.5 stories, it's still a 3rd story. Does that mean flat roof?
You can't.
Oh, I thought you said you could.
There's nothing that would prohibit a flat roof. So you could,
Prohibit, so that means that there's something that stops it.
but
You could do a 2-story with a flat.
you could do a 2-story with a flat roof, but you could not take that building and create a 3rd story if you decide to make the story limitation 2.5.
Correct.
Just by flattening that out, yes, it becomes a 3rd story and that would be prohibited. But you could take that building and not have a half story and put a flat roof on it.
So you stopped it from being a 40-foot flat roof.
Monolith.
Right. And just thinking out loud, I mean, I don't dislike what you said, Alyssa, about 40 feet, 2.5 stories. In my mind, I mean, if that's 36 feet, I'm again, still thinking about this part of town here, and I'm thinking selfishly about our office building because I'm very familiar with it. I'd be shocked if that building's not 40 feet tall. It's very, very tall. It's probably over 40 feet tall.
I'm looking at it, I would be surprised if it isn't less than 40 feet.
And so in my mind, the difference between 37 or 36 feet and 40 feet, if it's 2.5 stories, isn't going to cause a dramatic change in the view, for example, or creating a quote-unquote monolith. That doesn't seem to be a concern to me.
I think,
And also-
I think there's also, that building sits back.
And that's exactly where I was going.
It's also elevated too, right? You have
So if you will look at, and we're going to get there in just a second, the minimum setback within the supporting zoning district where your office building is 25 feet. That's the minimum front setback. So in addition to it being, a little higher, it's further set back, so the perception of it as being a monolith is not going to happen.
Right, like your building's like a good 50 feet setback right now.
But the minimum is 25 feet.
Right. I like the minimum of 35 if he gets 10% leeway instead of, that way we're not busting the 40-foot plane. If we put the 40 foot on there, then they go 44, even if they do it, it still raises the height. And then, if we do 35, it only gets them to 40.
Yeah, you still get to the 40 feet, which is probably fine, but it doesn't go to 44.
But it doesn't go to 44 feet. And I think that's a huge concern I've never heard. Not one person's ever come
With
and
it
said
only
we want
25
50-foot
feet back.
buildings.
I mean, to me, we're splitting hairs. It's a very good conversation. I'm just thinking, those buildings, if they're over 35 now, they obviously wouldn't be non-conforming if we made it 35, they wouldn't be non-conforming because.
Well, they would be non-conforming. They'd be non-conforming structures. There'd be non-conforming structures.
Right, so from an architectural standpoint, if somebody wanted to rebuild one of those and the limit was 35 feet,
With a 10% variance.
10% variance,
So
so.
give it the height they need.
So that's raises, so why have this 10%? Why don't you just have a number?
So we talked about this last time. So it's a situation where typically that administrative modification does not happen in the front end. It happens in the back end. It happens when they realize that they've graded the site improperly, or when various things happen. And so what happens at the end of the process is when they do their final plans, they realize that they are a foot over the maximum height because of how they graded the lot. So then what happens is they end up having to go in front of the BOA and request a variance. The administrative modification allows Kevin or Mark to say, okay, you're a foot off because of how you graded. That's fine. So let's do this. I mean, I hate to add another variable into this discussion.
Can we clarify that though? So it doesn't mean that just because they want to do something larger.
They get to do that, right?
Right. There has to be a reason.
Right, and we talked about that at length, and we can, if you want me to read it to you, I can. There has to be something happen that necessitates Mark and Kevin giving that administrative modification. It's just not a gimme.
I feel like we might be like overcorrect. We're very far down from 50 feet forward. And then we have 2.5 stories, so that's the ones in one water. I don't know.
I mean, has anybody come to anybody that said we want 50-foot buildings?
Oh, and the 50 foot is gone. The 50 foot is gone. The only question is twofold. Do you want to increase the height from 35 to 40 in the supporting zone if, and only if, you limit the number of stories? I don't think anyone has any indication that they want to increase that height if you don't limit the number of stories. But I'm hearing you want to limit the number of stories.
I'm thinking we want to limit the number of stories.
And perhaps to 2.5.
Right, that's what I'm hearing.
That's what I'm hearing.
I wouldn't want to go any higher than that because if it's only a 25-foot setback, right, that looks different than your building.
Right.
Your building's pretty set back.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't use that as an example, but.
I like the example for height, you know what I mean, but it's, you know.
All right, so we've made a decision. We're going to limit the number of stories. The number of stories is 2.5. We've made that decision. Unless I'm misunderstanding. Yeah. The mayor's going to give me his gavel in a second. All right, now the question becomes, so let's just look at the core. The core is like where one island is and where, the women's building is, all that. Suddenly, so it's going to be 40 feet and 2.5 stories. Everybody okay with that?
Well, so the thing is 35 feet, 10% variable gets it to 40 feet, roughly.
No, again, it's 10%, which is 3.5 feet.
Yes.
Which is not 40 feet. And there has to be a compelling reason by which Mark and Kevin grant that. It's not a gimme.
Yeah.
I think it's difficult for us to really deal with these height issues if indeed, and if your building is over 35 feet now, it doesn't make sense to reduce the level of existing structures that are on that side of the street. We talked about flat roofs. If you limit it to 2.5 stories, then I think we can go 40 feet throughout the entire district. The only place flat roofs come into place is the Highland Theater building. All those buildings are flat roofs. And the same issue applies there.
That's 3 stories, is it?
No.
It's not.
No, it's 2 stories. But it's a tall 2 stories because of the theater.
Right.
When we talked about this originally, you were like, well, a lot of people like it, like the denser CBD districts, and as they taper off as they go into the residential zones, because when people walk through the city, which we're an extremely walkable city, bikes, others obviously scooters people see, as you walk into something that's subtle, and then kind of hits it downtown and tapers off into the stuff, right? So the taller we could make these, the edges of the property doesn't taper off as much.
It's still going to taper off because the setbacks are different. Because right now in the core, the setbacks are right at the street.
Okay. So now, I'm sorry, maybe I'm missing something. So what would the new setbacks be for the buildings then? So this would change the buildings that are on the street?
So let's back
have to
up.
be set back?
So
I think
where you see the peak,
Yeah.
that's the core.
Okay.
And that, for example, would have a 0 front setback.
Okay.
So the buildings are there, it's more intense. The light orange is the supporting, so that's everything basically from the Masonic Lodge to Forest, the city building, the lot behind West Banco, and then from the women's building down to Montvale. All of that is the supporting.
Okay.
And the minimum front setback there is 25 feet. So therefore, instead of buildings being right at the street, they are then at least 25 feet. So we are already creating that transition into residential by doing that, by saying you have to have a minimum of a 25-foot setback.
Let's see, what about the parking situation? Are they allowed parking in front, or does that have to go around the
No,
side or back?
they're not allowed to have parking in front.
What about when you consider a 2.5-story building, so you have a gable? So what is could somebody just line the whole roof with dormers? Where you've really maximized the footprint of that half-story towards really 3 stories, as far as density goes?
Yeah, but it would still, from the outside, look like 2.5 because.
Right. But did you?
I mean, the 2.5 isn't really 2.5. It's really 3 because, I mean, unless you're just using it as an attic space. But if you have a 2.5-story house, you have room up there. It's just.
But if you look at that picture of the coffin, if you line the side of that with dormers,
Yeah, then
you've got the
space.
square footage of a 3rd story, but you've qualified as a 2.5.
You know what I said?
So you theoretically could, but again, it's not going to be a usable 3rd story in the same way a flat roof would be, because you would have all of the issues of the dormer. We certainly,
Attic space?
I'm sorry?
Storage space?
It could be a storage, and you could have garret rooms, right? You certainly could have garret efficiencies or something up there. We certainly could,
I was just wondering, is there an architectural standard where at some point, if you line up the usable square footage footprint of that half-story on coffin building, I'm guessing is roughly 1/3 of the footprint of the building.
correct. I think that's probably true.
If you added dormers down each side, you could turn that 1/3 into 2/3, 3/4.
I don't think you would, because they were going to be limited by the usability of those dormers. But your point's well taken. Theoretically, you could shove, let's just take that building there, you could put 2 dormers on each side, and you could get 4 efficiency apartments up there, if you did that. So if you would like, we could put either an architectural standard or something else in there that would preclude those dormers, if that would make you feel better.
I think dormers look nice. I just mean as far as
The intensity, because again, we're dealing with 2 separate things. We're dealing with height and intensity.
Well, the zoning people oversees all these areas.
yeah, that's a good point.
I didn't hear what, I'm sorry, Lauren.
Didn't we discuss just making 1 floor residential or could it do a dormer about that then?
So we did not discuss it here. We have not discussed,
But we could,
you could do that. You could say,
and then that's a,
and then that settles it.
Could you also limit the units that go into a building? Like if there's residential above, it might be 1 story, but in that 1 story, somebody might put 4 units, like you said. Could you limit the amount of units that are used in the supporting area to where it could only be 1 or 2 residences above that?
Sure, we could do it by use, we could do it by architectural standards, there are any number of ways
You
to,
already have the 8,000 square feet for the first, so that applies here, doesn't it?
no, there are no density standards in the central business district at all.
So the dormers would be nice, and I don't know about, on that building, I don't know why somebody wouldn't be able to have an apartment up there, but just create some density requirements. When we do that.
I hesitate to do density, I would prefer to do more what Jeff said,
Units.
number of units.
That's the same thing, isn't it?
It is, but I think we could probably do that differently. So let me, between now and the 19th, see if I can, how best to do that. And give it some thought process to it. Because we obviously could use Lauren's example, which is no dwelling units above the 2nd floor.
No separate dwelling units?
Right. So you couldn't put 4, efficiencies up there.
But you could still use the space if it's connected as a part of the main floor.
They'd have to be able to use it for them together.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let me think about how to do that.
Most of those houses are single-family homes, right? That are in the supporting.
No, I mean, but there's also US Bank and Guardian Bank.
They don't have residential.
No, but that's not developed, because you can't think about that, you have to think about that as well. Like if one of those banks go away, what's going to happen there?
Okay. All right, one take.
And Andy, when you're talking about the dormers, you're referring to like large dormers that you're concerned, right? Not the small, just window decorative, right? You're talking like a massive dormer.
Yeah, I mean, he's talking about taking,
I just want to make sure I was, right, yeah.
But then I don't think that would pass the design review. and that they oversee both of these business areas.
Yeah, well, that's just one thing I want Elisa to be able to
Right.
consider, because what you're talking, you're not talking about just decorative, nice, like an extra window, you're talking like a massive dormer, which would truly give.
Perspective, if you have a
Space.
150-foot wide building, dormers along it, and the peak is on the gables on the sides,
Yeah.
dormers are pretty. I'm just talking about the density part of it.
Right, yeah. I mean, that's the issue. Architecturally, we can handle it. It's the issue of suddenly that half story becomes
3 stories.
3 stories. From the standpoint of that.
Yeah, from the standpoint of that.
Right, okay. So but between now and the 19th, I'll add that to the list and we'll think about how to meet your goal of dealing with what's already out there, like Ben's business and all those others, but keep down the intensity on the site.
Elisa,
Yes, sir.
it's actually covered in the definition of a half story, that the maximum floor area for half story is 60% of the floor area below it. So it doesn't matter how many dormers you want to put up there, you can't put too many dormers up there because you can only, maximum usable square footage for the half story is 60% of the floor area below.
So that's the. That's the floor area. We're talking about comparing it to the cost, and you're just changing the pitch of the roof essentially. Or like, can you have like what do you call the barn?
Gambrel roof, the barn, like a barn?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
You
gambrel.
can do that and get 60%, which would look a lot worse than that, but it'd still technically be a half story.
As long as the maximum, the ways to find, and it's actually in the building code, is you have to have a minimum of 5-foot height, ceiling height. So with this one here, the 5 foot is actually more towards the center of that
So it
half
truncates
story.
the sides.
So it truncates the sides, and the maximum 5 feet or more head height area is a maximum of 60% of the floor area of the second floor.
I would eliminate flat roofs as well too, then
Well, no.
60%.
It would just limit
It would just
putting in a
limit
bunch of dormers to make 2/3 of the floor below or 3/4, whatever. It has to be a maximum of 6. So the steeper the roof is,
The less usable.
the flatter the roof is, the less area you have, usable area, livable area you have.
Because of the height.
Because of the height, a minimum of 5 feet, but the steepness will be taken care of by the maximum height of 35, 40 feet, whatever is decided upon. So
In Ted Engelhardt's geometry class, I think
Because that's exactly
what it is. You take the triangle and you come in like this, and as that comes down, it goes out further and minimizes the space.
Did we say that half story is somebody said efficiency, I'm a little confused, does that mean a rentable space?
Yeah.
A half story?
Again, we don't cover whether it's ownership or ownership through the zoning ordinance. That's
I mean,
not.
could we create it where the half story cannot be, has to be storage? Or is it, so that way it's not office space, or is that the deal?
So you
I'm just throwing this out there, I don't know the conversation.
And you
You know,
certainly
Somebody said
can-
efficiency, that means rental to me, efficiency unit.
You certainly could limit the usability of the half story if you would like. We could add that to the discussion with the planning commission. And I appreciate Mark's input, but 60% is still of of a building is still a lot of floor area in terms of intensity. So let's have a conversation with the planning commission about the usability of that half story. Thank you, Mark, very much.
It's only the floor below.
Yeah, 60% of the floor below, right.
That's not the whole building.
Right, but I'm saying 60%, if that building was bigger, that would still be, in terms of intensity of use,
Right.
would still be a fairly usable space.
I just don't want us to get to the point where we create those zoning structures, say all the buildings to this thing, whatever you call it.
The dump lot, when I was scrolling back.
That
Thank you.
none of them become, they all become non-conforming by virtue of the zoning.
So we are,
Building, for example, but if we create a zoning structure that says that building is no longer conforming, I think that defeats the purpose in trying to keep those houses the way they are.
so we have already made decisions that make large portions of downtown non-conforming. So for example, non-conforming structures, one Highland is non-conforming. All of those buildings that are over 35 feet, the supporting area, are non-conforming. So a non-conforming structure can be rebuilt if something happens to it. I mean, that is allowed in the zoning ordinance. But the other thing you need to think about is the more you constrain the property, like US Bank and Guardian Bank, similar to what we were talking about with the gas station, the least likely it's going to be redeveloped. So you have to think about both those things. You have to think about what are you doing to the existing structures that are out there, and then you have to think about what happens over time. So if Guardian Bank does it, goes away at some point in time, and we have restricted the property so greatly that it can't be redeveloped, then truthfully, you're going to get secondary, less than desirable uses going in those spaces.
And we're currently, if we make restrictions, we're devaluing the property as it goes.
What?
I was just saying that was a joke.
Okay. I don't know that you are devaluing it, but you are definitely changing the value of it.
Yeah.
And we're going from one extreme to the other, right? Like right now, the development standards in downtown and Midway don't exist. The only restriction that you have is height, and that's 50 feet. So we've gone from a funnel that's this big to this big through this process. So I think you use this process to create the place that you want, but fully understand what as best as we can know today, sitting here, because we don't know what the economics of property and construction are going to be 10 years from now, but know that you are putting greater restrictions on the property that may make it more difficult to redevelop. And for those parcels like Guardian Bank or whatever, banks are not going to be there forever.
As we change those standards, can it causes certain buildings to become non-conforming? I don't know what the implications of that are in terms of not being able to do certain things, but could we, in a sense, grandfather some of those structures in so they are not non-conforming because of these changes, but if you redevelop it in some way, then they become subject to the new standards? Does that make sense?
I think so. So the way the non-conforming language is currently structured, all of the buildings are grandfathered. They can continue to exist. It's not a problem. If something happens to them, a tornado comes through, they can be reconstructed. So one Highland could be built again, assuming they don't build, the only caveat to that is if you destroy your non-conforming building yourself, then you can't rebuild it. But if a tornado came through and mowed down one Highland, it could be rebuilt exactly as it exists today.
You can't rebuild it exactly as it exists, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, you could, because it's a non-conforming structure, and as long as you start the process within 6 months of the act happening, you don't cause the act, you can rebuild your non-conforming structure.
If it's voluntary, you take it down, you can't build it back the same way.
Correct.
You're subject to the new standard.
You're subject to the new standards. It's very difficult. We would have to have a very detailed understanding of all the buildings that are out there and what makes them non-conforming in order to create what you were talking about. I mean, we'd have to look at Ben's building, we'd have to look at all the other ones and say, and it would be an administrative nightmare, to be truthful with you. So what most people do is if they value the structures that they have but don't want anything new, is they just say, it's non-conforming, it can last forever, and if it's not voluntarily, if something happens to it, like it burns down or a tornado, it can be rebuilt. And the reason
I didn't know if there are other implications of being non-conforming.
No, in some places it is. If it's not conforming, you're just out of luck. But your current language and the language that's currently in the code does allow it to be rebuilt. And the reason that's important is from the standpoint of getting a loan, for example, or getting insurance. You can't get insurance on the building if you can't rebuild it, right? So, or you can't get a loan. Those are things you have to think about as well. So they're going to be okay, but.
I have a comment too, just by virtue of this conversation, and we're pretty far into the weeds, but Adam, you mentioned the possibility of talking about that half story, so 2 and then the half story. Maybe we could limit the use there to storage. You couldn't have an office, or you couldn't have an efficiency apartment. I'm pretty firmly opposed to that idea, and the reason, we can have a conversation, but there's a lot of uses currently where those are offices or maybe efficiency apartments. They have to be small. I'll just tell you, I mean, in the name of restricting density, which I think we all pretty firmly believe in, you're not restricting much density by saying, well, you have to use that as storage only. You can't have an office or 2 up there. And I don't like the concept of any level of government telling people what they can and can't do with a space like that. And frankly, I mean, the Pendry building is pretty big. And we've got a half story up there. There are 2 offices up there with 2 people. And frankly, there should only be 1. I mean, it's tight. And so if you're talking about in the future redevelopment, well, let's tell somebody who builds something there that that can only be storage, it can't be office, it can't be residential. I don't think we're doing any good to really limit density. I think we're talking about all these other ways to limit density. I don't think dictating what somebody could do with that half story is a way to really effectively limit density. That's kind of
I completely disagree. Do you agree with him? I completely disagree. Anytime you add space, that's usable space for someone to live or rent. 1 person is density, 2 people is density, and you had 10 or 20 of them, it's density. I completely disagree with that. You know,
Well,
I mean, I thought the whole idea of this whole thing was to rent density.
Yeah, so we're gonna come back with the planning commission in June.
Have density and allow people to do what they want to do with it.
Yeah, we'll have a discussion about how to do this. I mean, it can be any number, like we talked about with Alexandria Pike. You can say permitted by right is 2.5 stories, and if you want to put residential up there, it's a conditional use. I mean, that way you can deal with those types of things. So we can find a way to make this work. But just so that you're aware, let's define some terms. Density is usually related to residential. Intensity is non-residential. So let's
That's good work. I don't think you've used that, but I'm worried about both. You know what I mean?
Okay, and that's fine,
Yeah.
but let's just use our terms in a way that we're all understanding the same thing.
Yeah.
All right, so we're at 2.5 stories. We're 40 feet in the core.
I'm a 35 feet guy.
And then for the supporting district, do we want to do 35 or 40?
I would, to Adam's point, I would, just because of the setbacks that are different from the core to the supporting, and the way that looks, I would be in favor of 35, given that you can go up a little bit more, but 35 in the core and 40 in the supporting, so it graduates, the setbacks graduate.
I think you want to flip that.
To be the other way. 35 core, right, because you don't have a setback.
Oh.
0 setback. Right, so that brings it right up to the curve, and so I would want that lower, right? You go out to the supporting, you can go back 25 feet, you can have a building where it's more like Ben's building, it's higher, it doesn't create a kind of a corridor.
So you certainly can do that. From an urban design standpoint, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So you will not, your right of way is so wide. What's the right of way? Like in front of one half.
It's a,
Yeah.
I would say 60 feet, but at least 60.
So you're not going to,
What's 60,
the right of way width. As long as you have a 1-to-1 ratio between the height of the building and the width of the right of way, you won't create that cavern that you're concerned about. If you go more than 1-to-1, you will.
84 feet.
And the right of way in front of One Highland is 84 feet. So I don't think you need to worry about creating the cavern that you're concerned about. If you go 35 feet in the core, not only is One Highland going to be non-conforming, I would think all of those buildings become non-conforming. Wouldn't surprise me.
So that's what I was getting at. What's the real implication of it becoming non-conforming? That was my question.
Right, I mean, it's just what we just said, which is,
It doesn't seem like that big of a deal, other than if you want to tear it down yourself. Unless I'm misunderstanding.
no, I mean, do we want to reverse those numbers?
Liz, am I right though that if you tore down this side of North Fort Thomas and you wanted to redevelop basically the same type of building, you're saying you probably could not?
Probably could not. I mean, I don't know that I mean, that's, and again, but I don't see that happening. I mean, those buildings are there, they're in the historic district, you'd have to have certificate of appropriateness. That's the other thing we have to keep thinking about, right? All of this is subject to what the Design Review Board would say about any replacement structures. You're more likely to get demolition at Guardian Bank and Fifth Third Bank and US Bank and all of those things.
I want to talk about intensity again. And I don't know if anybody's driven through town. I'm sure everybody has here a lot in the last year and a half, but the amount of delivery trucks that are parking on the street, the amount of traffic that goes in and out of these businesses that are doing great is about maxed out. I mean, there are 2-ton trucks stopped in the middle of the street now. You go around the back, there's people parked there. There's constantly cars unloading things. And the more density we have, whether it's 2 offices, 4 offices on top, it adds intensity. And I think it's a real concern of people who want to drive through town, walk through town, and be safe. And I think that's a valid concern. You know, I can appreciate squeezing an office or 2 in, as Ben said, but I'm completely against that because I think people enjoy the town the way it is. And we continue to add, which I think these are fantastic adds. The Tower Park structure is unbelievable. The new track is going to be unbelievable. And all these things that we're adding to the park systems are just going to drive more people through town and in town. And the more we add, the more intense it gets and the less user-friendly it gets for people who are paying for it. I think we need to be very cognizant of that. You know what I mean? So I think, and then people like to walk through town, they move here, or walk in town, and then you enclose them in the center of town. I just think it's not what, I haven't had anybody come to me and said they want more of anything. I've only had the complete opposite. Not one person has said they want 50 feet. Nobody said they want 40 feet. Nobody said they want more businesses. And I think I represent them and not my beliefs.
I don't disagree with you at all. You're painting with a really broad brush when you say that people want things the way they are. Well, the way they are is there's usable space on the half-story above. So what you're talking about doing would be limiting that to only a story. So I'm not proposing that we increase density or intensity by allowing an efficiency or an office above. That's currently what a lot of these are used for. I'd be shocked if any of these buildings have just an attic. Usable space.
I don't think it changes anything that's being used now, but it changes things that can be used in the future. And that's my concern. I can't do anything about today, but I can do things about tomorrow. And I think people are happy with the way things are today. They just don't want to see any more. And that's what I'm trying to limit. That's
I think one of the questions was we can't really quantify if you went to 2.5 and you allowed residential for them that half story and everything that could be developed that way within the core, say, what would that do to density? I mean, we don't have any firm,
So we can run some rough numbers between now and the 19th that says, what that would mean in terms of square footage and those kinds of things. I mean, we can run that for you between now and the 19th and have that as a data point as you're discussing.
I mean, if you added 30 people in a city of 17 to 18,000 living within this area, surrounding area, I don't see that. If it's 300, yeah, that's.
I don't think you're not, as this is currently drafted, you're not going to get 300 people.
Right, I'm just putting numbers up, but there's some scale where you're lower into that, it's maybe not as big a deal.
But I think if you had density in the business district, and as far as workers go, then you had cars, you had barrels, people coming in town.
All right, so this is, I think I'm in the interest of just sort of trying to move this conversation along. We've made one decision. We're looking at 2.5 stories, so that's a good thing. The next question is the discussion about the actual maximum height. Eric has brought up reversing those numbers. Do you want to continue the discussion of maximum height with the Planning Commission, or do you want to continue that discussion now?
By reverse.
So right now,
I thought you said 40 across the board, 40 and core.
No, that was just one idea that someone brought up as through all of this process. Right now, as it's currently drafted, the maximum building height in the core is 40 feet, and the maximum permitted height in supporting is 35 feet. You had said reverse that.
I didn't realize, I thought it was 40.
No, you had said reverse that, right? So that it was 35 at the core because the buildings are closer to the street. And actually, if that actually happened, it would start feeling squatty, like the subway building. That's what would happen as you reduce height and the buildings are at the street, when you have a wide right of way, the urban design effect is that the buildings feel squatty. So do we want to continue this discussion about maximum height now? Do we want to punt it to the Planning Commission in June?
I think I would like to talk to the Planning Commission more about
Okay.
it, just because they seem to have a little bit more understanding of the applications.
Okay.
And I also believe that, I think that 40 feet throughout is more of what our existing conditions are when you talk about Ben's building. And I think all the other restrictions we're talking about may solve the problems that we're talking about, but we've heard that, we're talking planning.
Yeah.
Can we get an example? I'd love an example. I'd like to know how tall Ben's building is.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, I keep using.
I'd like to see some examples.
I keep using ours as an example because I'm so familiar, but it might not be a good example because it's a little bit of a unicorn. It sits so far back and it's on a big lot. I'm curious about the height of some of these buildings, like between Masonic Lodge and Fifth Road.
So I'm going to do two things between now and that discussion. I'm going to just run some rough numbers in terms of the amount of square footage that we think might be on these 7 floors right now. So I'll have that number in front of you. I will get a height of your building as best as I can off Google Earth. And then as we have this discussion in the midway, I do have some heights of some of those existing buildings to add to that discussion. But before I'm sorry?
I'm sorry.
So I will have those numbers for you when we continue this discussion in June. How's that?
Yeah, great.
Awesome. All right, let's move on.
So one quick point. So all we're talking about in the CBD is opposite of One Highland and next to here, in between here and, well, just from here all the way down to the women's, right? That's it.
So look at the map.
Yeah, that's it. Because nobody's tearing down One Highland.
Yeah, I don't see anybody tearing down One Highland. I don't see anybody.
So for this height, all we're really talking about is this, right here, right?
That's the core, right? That's the core.
The setback, because all of this setback is 25 feet.
All of that's 25 feet, correct. Correct. That's all we're talking about. And let's talk about what's most likely to redevelop. It's the banks,
Right.
all of which are in the supporting zone. Whether it's Fifth Third or Guardian or US Bank, all of them are in orange. Those are the sites that are most likely. Yeah.
Are you staying on this area for a few minutes?
Yes.
Not necessarily this topic, but this area?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Is there something you want to talk about?
Well, yeah, at some point I'd like to, back on this map, I would like to talk about that, the supporting district, basically from, for lack of a better term, it might not be specific, but the green line are shown down the forest, and on the other side, bluegrass this way before you hit the city building. Because there's such a mixed use there, obviously, there's the bank. Talking about the west side of North Thomas Ave, you've got Fifth Third Bank, you've got a single family residential home next to that, and then you've got 3 or 4, they're not residential, they are, but they're mixed use, more or less.
Right, there are 5 of them,
Before
yeah.
you hit the Masonic Lodge, right?
Yes, there are 5.
There's 5, okay. So I'm curious about those 5 homes, because I hear from a lot of people in town that they're very, obviously they're sentimental, they bring a lot of character to the town, they've been there forever, there's a lot of concern about the potential to, in the future, have this go away and become something else. So I'm just curious in the proposal, what are we looking at as options for those homes, or for those mixed-use homes?
I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead to that, and we'll come back to these other discussions. Okay. So in terms of permitted uses, like all the other non-residential districts, their typical office and retail are permitted in both the core and the supporting. And then the Planning Commission did decide to prohibit the drive-throughs that are currently in downtown. So those would become non-conforming uses. And then after your discussion last month, hotels will then be removed from that list. So we're going to be talking about exactly the area that Ben's talking about in the next 2 slides, which is that light orange area. It has.
What is the PMR stand for now? Go back. Permitted and restricted. Okay.
Oh, sure. Okay. So T is permitted by right. As long as they meet all of the standards within the zoning district, they go in. R is restricted, and that means there are standards by which they have to meet before they are permitted. If they can't meet those standards, then they become a conditional use. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, so basically restricted, it's not completely restricted, they can be used, they can still be used in those areas.
They can still be used subject to the restrictions in the zoning ordinance. Did you have a question about a particular one?
I just saw the artist studio and artisanal studio, and I just didn't understand what that.
Yeah, so those are actually in the residential subzoning district,
Okay.
which are the homes on Miller, Lumley, and Audubon Place.
Yeah.
And so they are allowed, but they are restricted uses, and the major restriction there is the percentage of the floor area of the home that can be used non-residentially. And truthfully, that was a situation where the Planning Commission had a discussion about, we understand that today those homes are zoned central business district. So they have a certain value because they are not non-residential. Because they're not zoned residential, they're zoned central business district. We understand that the community members want those homes to stay residential, but we also can't take away all the value that that property currently has because it's zoned central business district. So the solution was those homes now become conforming uses because they're permitted by right. And if they want to have some small amount of non-residential, they're permitted to do so as a residential use. So that was the compromise. It makes all of those homes conforming uses, and it gives them some non-residential rights.
What about if somebody wanted to buy one of those homes and turn it into a resident, renovate it, obviously, within the guidelines, and make it a single-family residential?
They can. Now, we're talking about the residential district right now, so we're not talking about the homes. So because Adam had asked about.
I was just, when I was reading
Okay.
through this earlier, I was trying to figure out what was what and where and why, and that's, thank you.
Yeah, okay, so let's go back. Completely losing my train of thought. Okay. So here we are. So the UDO classifies the single-family detached dwellings that are currently located there as an R. And that means it's a restriction, and the restriction is that they have to exist the day the ordinance is drafted in order for them to be a permitted use. So what that does, just as we were just talking about those homes, they go from being non-conforming uses, which has much greater consequence than a non-conforming structure, to becoming a restricted use. So suddenly they can all go back to single family if they choose to.
As is proposed.
As is currently drafted. What you see on the screen is as is currently drafted. So
just for sake of clarity, and then I know you said this several times, how is it currently, not in the draft, not in the proposal, current zoning?
Currently, the one home that is used as a residence is a non-conforming use, which means they can't expand. And that's a big deal. I mean, if you want to use that home and you want to add a bathroom at the back, you can't. Which is the same case for the homes on Miller and Lumley.
Okay, and then the homes to the south of the home that you're talking about, so you have Fifth Third, that home, and then the other homes down the block, currently, in current zoning, those are, I believe they're all mixed use to an extent. There's residential and there's some office or, et cetera on the first floor. Currently, those could go back to single family?
Not under your existing ordinance, but under this proposal, those could go back to single family, yes.
To me, that seems important. I mean, who knows what's going to happen, but it's the same as our office building. If somebody wanted to buy our office building and turn that into a single-family residence, I don't know why we preclude them from doing it. So we're talking about limiting density. That's the way to do that too. That you don't have a bunch of people running in and out the door from each private and you got a family living there. And I think that part of town, the family atmosphere and the family dynamic is obviously for everybody is valuable.
Right. So let me give you a real life example. The home that is on Audubon Place, that was formerly an attorney's office. They wanted to convert, and it was zoned central business district, and they wanted to convert it back to a single family home. They actually had to come in front of the Planning Commission and the council and rezone it to R1C to order to convert it back to a single family home. Under this proposal, they wouldn't have to do that. Your home, your business could be converted back to a home without any zoning issue at all, as this is currently drafted. So we are legitimizing those homes and allowing them to convert back. The question, and what the reason this slide is here is some community members have asked that single-family homes be permitted by right, that there be no restriction on them. And what that does is it would, for example, if you said that, it means the construction of new single-family homes in places where they don't currently exist, like the Fifth Third Bank and US Bank and Guardian Bank. Those could be torn down and become single-family homes. And so the question in front of you is, do you want to allow the construction of new single-family homes in places where those homes don't exist today?
Repeat that again, I'm sorry.
I was thinking about what you previously said.
So we have protected the homes that exist today that are being used either as homes or as mixed use. That
In these areas.
in these areas. But for those sites that are in a supporting subzoning district that are not currently having a home sitting on them, Fifth Third Bank, Guardian Bank, US Bank, should it be possible to build a home there? Community members have said that instead of that R, an R in that column, it should be a P. And then what that does, and whether or not that would ever happen, I wouldn't think that it would, but it does open it up that if someone wanted to buy the Fifth Third Bank and put in single-family detached dwellings, they would be permitted to do so if you change that from an R to a P. So that was the question in front of you.
You said single-family homes that you do just like more than one on them?
I'm sorry?
You said single-family homes. Were you talking about all the different lots or on any particular? It's not, you couldn't put multifamily, or you couldn't put multiple units on this.
You could take Fifth Third Bank and divide it.
If it becomes,
If it becomes a P, yeah, you could take Fifth Third Bank and divide it in half and put 2 homes there.
How big is that?
That's pretty big.
Yeah. What do we have? I can't fathom somebody paying all the money for that, and a big lot, to build one home there.
Were there 3 there at one time, or just 2?
I don't know what historically has been there.
Would they be able to put a private drive down the middle and have multiple homes through and out that, because that property is pretty deep?
That property is very deep, that particular one. If you make the choice to make this a P instead of an R, then we're going to have to deal with precisely that question. I don't think that's a question at US Bank and Guardian Bank, but it becomes a question on that lot, because that lot goes all the way back to like Woodland.
Restrict lot size.
You could restrict lot size, you could do all sorts of things. But the first question is, we started this process with the Planning Commission with the goal of trying to get rid of some of the nonconformities that you have. And we heard from community members that those homes are valued as homes. So we made it an R. The next question, but then people have said, we want the option of some of these parcels that may be developed to become homes.
Were they talking about businesses, or were they talking about the actual ones that are businesses on the first floor? Commercial. Commercial, not Fifth Third.
So they talk about Fifth Third and Guardian and US Bank. Those 3 sites, the idea that those could become single-family homes.
I'm getting a little confused, but they're buildings that Ben was talking about, I think, can go back to single family.
Yes,
right? Without having to jump through a lot of hoops, right?
As this is currently drafted,
Okay.
every single solitary one of them could convert to a single-family home tomorrow or the day after this ordinance is adopted with no zoning hoops to jump through.
Okay.
That's handled. They are no longer non-conforming uses. That's dealt with. The next step is, do you want to say that you can put single-family homes where they don't exist today?
And on that note, like if they came back and built a home, when it comes to the character of that area, could they build really whatever they want, or I feel like commercial, there's some restrictions, right, to kind of develop it as.
So again, it's all in the historic district, so it would have to go in front of the design review board. And we do have very detailed design standards that regulate the construction of the non-residential structures. There are none for residential.
Would this fall in the, I'm sorry, Lauren, on my point, go ahead.
Well, I just feel like that could really greatly change the character of that whole street.
I agree, that's what I'm gonna piggyback on hers, and would we put, if we did this, would we put it under the same guidelines that we're putting on North Fort Thomas and South Fort Thomason?
So again, this is in the historic district, which Fort Thomas Avenue overlay is not.
Okay.
So no matter what goes back there, it would have to go in front of the design review board, and the design review board has guidelines that were adopted, and it would have to meet those guidelines. So while there are no defined design standards in the code, you do have a design review board. It is in the historic district, and it would have to be in compliance with those design guidelines. So there
It would be
is.
a modern house in this.
I'm not going to make that statement
Yeah, right.
because the design
It'd be
review
very
board.
difficult.
The design review board is populated by individuals who will interpret their design guidelines as they see fit. But it would be more difficult for that to happen, given the design guidelines that the design review board works.
Nothing's impossible regardless.
So, can I also, I just want to, like, for you to refresh my memory here. So if you were to take 3 of those houses that were originally residential houses across the street from here and combine them, you'd have roughly 120 feet. Tore all 3 down.
You'd have roughly 100.
You'd have 100, yeah. So then, at that point, it's zoned in this, it's zoned TCS. Those lots are a little over, I think they're like 215 feet deep. So then you could, since the setback, front setback's 25 feet, rear setback is 25 feet. You're allowed to put parking underneath the buildings. You could put a 75-foot long building by 150 feet deep.
Are you talking about as something besides single family?
Yes.
Okay, so let's again remember what we're permitting in this district and what all the development standards are. So for example, the maximum building width in the supporting district is 75 feet, which is the district, the width of the building at the street. We do not have a maximum depth requirement. We certainly could put one in, but yes, you theoretically could take those 3 lots, tear everything down, combine them, and create one development. But what you would have is a building that would have to be no more than 75 feet wide, and you have to have 15 feet between them. So how big is the lot?
It would be 150 feet.
So it'd be 150 feet for all 3 of them. So you couldn't actually get 2 buildings there because 75 plus 75 plus 15 doesn't work.
Like, you'd only be able to put one,
You'd only be able to put one 75-foot wide building there.
that's 150 feet deep.
You do not have a maximum depth requirement. So yes, you could potentially have
So
a
that's
deep.
where, like, I think density requirements, where there's no density requirements.
Right.
So you could have a parking garage underneath, and you could have a massive building. But, and it's first floor would have to be commercial.
But keep in mind, in the supporting district, okay, yes, the first floor would have to be commercial. You could not have solely multifamily because it's not permitted in the
But second, and essentially, if you have a 2.5 story, that half story, that you've created a huge amount of space. So when you get into, that's where I really think we need to hone in on density to prevent something like that from being possible. Because somebody is going to overpay for land to do a development, because the land part of the development is what, like 15% of the development. So you can overpay, tear them down and build a huge building and make money.
You're right.
Would have to go through the historic overlay.
It would happen, 2 things would have to happen. They would have to get a COA to demolish the 3 structures. And then they would have to go before the design review board to then get approval. We could do one of 2 things. We can limit the density, or we can put a maximum depth on the building. Either one of those things would work. Right now, your current standard is, I believe, 2 to 1. You can't have more, it's a 2-1 ratio.
A depth would solve that.
What about adding a minimum and maximum lot size? So you couldn't put a 75-foot building on one lot. You couldn't take all 3 and turn them into one lot.
Well, you can't, either way, you can't do that now. Because if you took all 3 of those, you couldn't get 2 buildings on it. You'd only get 75 feet.
Yeah.
So that's handled.
But with the lot depth,
With the depth, but we could put a maximum depth on the building.
what about lot size? So you're not restricting you're restricting basically a massive building from going in there. If you put if you can't split those 3 lots into one, if you can't make them one lot, if they have to remain in 3 lots, if we put restrictions on the lot size to keep them as 3 lots, then that eliminates.
Well, if you're doing that, you just keep them, then they're not in the TCS essentially.
Because you have to go before council, so it's going, I mean, I'm thinking
So you couldn't make them go before council. And I was about to say this, the other thing is you could do is either have a maximum depth requirement. That would be a tougher road to hoe, to try to do a maximum lot area. But we could make a building over a certain size a conditional use so that it gets an even greater layer of review. And the difference being that if a building meets the standards that are in the code and it's not a conditional use, it has to be approved. If you make it a conditional use, it becomes a discretionary versus a quasi-judicial decision versus an administrative one. And you still would have to allow it, but it would give the BOA some discretion in terms of what is exactly on that site. Because the reason I'm hemming and hawing is in my head, what I'm seeing are all of the different lot sizes in terms of width and depth that you have from Forest Avenue all the way down to the post office. And so a maximum depth requirement might work in some places, but not in others. In other places, you might need, to change the maximum building. I mean, all of this becomes an exercise in math that may or may not work. I'm leaning more toward if the building is over X size, it becomes a conditional use. Does that
I would
make
also
sense?
like to have depth, because I'm looking at, as long as the scale of this is okay, the areas that I'm talking about all look about the same depth.
But then you get to,
Part of the lot.
the Fifth Third Bank building,
That's huge.
which is huge, but only part of it is in
Part of
central
it
business.
is- right.
Part of it is in is residential.
So that wouldn't, yeah, I'm just talking about the TCS.
Yeah, we could do a maximum depth just with the TCS. All right, so let's add that to the list of discussion items with the planning commission, and I'll come back with some options. How's that?
That's perfect.
Okay, we still haven't answered the question of do we want the single families to be permitted by right? Sorry. Sorry to bring it back to that.
Here, I think so. Sure. Absolutely.
Okay. Now, let me tell you what that
That's
says.
what you were asking then, right? No, you weren't.
So let me tell you what that says, and this is why the planning commission hasn't done it when they had this discussion. They have and I'm not going to try to speak for them, I'm just going to tell you what my understanding of what they said is, and obviously, is that this is a central business district. It is meant to be a central business district. And if you suddenly make single-family homes permitted by right, you are sending the signal that it's something other than a central business district. It is more residential in its nature.
So you're saying that they're suggesting making it a conditional.
So their suggestion was, when I said you really need to think about I said you need to think about making those homes conforming in some way, and the solution was an R. It legitimizes all the ones that are there, but it doesn't allow new ones. And
We're
that's
talking if we take on the Fifth Third again, we have to allow
right,
them to take that.
right. So
everything is there's used for a house now, can be, but it's not, okay.
So that's why they were hesitant to go from an R to a P.
I mean, I agree, because if you're trying to keep it a business district, then you don't want to crap you understand.
Yes, you're yes.
And it
yes.
still protects the homes that are there.
It protects the homes that are there, but it doesn't permit new ones. So, given that explanation, do we want to make homes permitted by right so that they can be in places where they aren't currently today?
I would say leave it where they craft.
That's how I feel.
Yeah, I would agree with leaving how they recommend it. Yes.
Agreed. Is there a restriction we can put on the bank building though? Would that be separated out where they could come back with residential property? What's that?
They can always come back and say, and propose a development there if they wanted to do so. But as it's currently drafted, if you keep it as an R, then they would be precluded from putting single-family detached dwellings there.
But they could do a one-off at the time if needed, to come back and if they wanted to put single-family properties on that, just that one lot, then they would be able to do that if they brought it up as a one-off.
Can they submit a
Can they submit a development plan for residential, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Yes, they
Yeah,
could.
they have to go through the process and be vetted and
They could do that, yes. All right.
And we have a good transition point. I'm going to make a motion for a restroom break.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let's do that now. Minimum and maximum front setback from Fort Thomas Avenue. And we dictate setbacks adjacent to the R1 districts as well. One of the specific standards is maximum building width. And in the phase 3 draft, the maximum building width was increased from 185 feet to 150 feet. And to give you a frame of reference, 185 feet is about the width of one Highland.
Just on the avenue?
Correct.
Or not the highway piece?
Correct. Just along the avenue, it's about 185 feet. And then back in April, the Planning Commission reduced the maximum building width in the Central Business District to 150 feet. So to give you a frame of reference, the city building that we're sitting in right now is roughly 170 feet. The building behind West Banco with the convenience mart in it is about 137 feet wide. So that gives you a frame of reference as to what those buildings, what 150 feet means. Do you have any concerns about this change from 185 feet to 150? As it relates only to town center.
What's the width of the lot at Fifth Third? It's 150 feet. It's 150 feet.
But that's a different subzone.
Okay.
As we were just talking about, in the supporting area, the maximum building width is 75 feet, which is about the width of Fifth Third Bank. So,
So in order for somebody to get 150 feet anywhere left in the central business district, they would almost have to buy the whole side of the street across the street?
so in order for 150 feet to be applicable, yes, everything across the street from One Highland would have to be mowed down.
As well as between Monley and the state.
So if you shorten that even further, the width down, say in that example, when you bought all those buildings, you couldn't do 150, if you did, let's just say it's a little longer, and you had like 275 or 80 foot sections. What's the distance in between the buildings? Do we have something set there? Like,
So because the maximum building width is so tall, so long in the core, there is no distance between buildings requirement. There is a distance between buildings requirement in supporting. There is not one currently. Does that make sense?
Does anybody want to reduce that from 150 to anything, 75, 100, 125?
why would there be 150-foot width maximum if we're only talking about really 2 opportunities for that to happen?
So if you'll notice the column there, that pertains to the Central Business District in terms of the core in town center. It pertains to the traditional business district, which is Inverness. It is also applicable in the core in Midway. So that is why it is sitting there. Now, having said that we could change that, right? That maximum building width could be more tailored to those subzoning districts. Because you're correct. If the maximum building width was decreased in town center, probably doesn't mean anything. That probably isn't going to hurt anything. We would have to have a very different conversation, as we were just talking about in the traditional business district at the gas station, where it is meaningful, or in Midway. But in downtown, reducing that is immaterial.
There was one thing that was building would it be a aesthetic, would it look much different?
Look like one island.
And not necessarily, it won't look like One Highland, because, I'm sorry, Laura.
I know, I was just saying, buildings there now are already this close to each other, what's the matter if they're one solid face?
Because of the height, because then they would just be one wall.
But keep in mind, we do have design standards that govern, in addition to the design guidelines that are used by the Design Review Board, there are design standards that govern the look of buildings. And then there are also standards in terms of development standards that require that there be breaks in the building. that's a very long-winded way of saying there are standards in the ordinance that would preclude the type of building that One Highland is. Because much of what we heard from the community is that building is perceived at the ground level to be the monolith that Eric is talking about. So as a result of that, we are requiring minimum building divisions, both horizontally and vertically, to prevent that from happening again.
Just to be clear, when you say breaks, it's still one continuous building, but there's a different depth of the,
There could be a different depth, there could be a different material, there could be something that would just break up.
but it's not separate. You're not talking about two separate.
No, we're not talking about separate buildings. We're talking about using materials and color and various other things so that the building does not appear to be so flat fronted from the street, because that's what I think what a lot of people are reacting to at One Highland is how it addresses the street.
I mean, I think what you're saying is basically just different material setbacks. It's still going to be one big wall though, right?
I mean, it will be,
It just will look different in sections every 20 feet. It'll look different.
it could potentially still be a wall. It could be set back. It could be material difference. It could be color difference. The perception is going to be that it's not one long wall. And if you remember when we were here in June, I showed you some pictures of another community where they had done that successfully based using the standards that are in this code.
What the height restriction we have right now in that area then is, it's currently 50, but it was getting reduced to as well, right?
So it's going to be 40 feet as it's currently drafted.
So the only place that this would affect in the CBD is if somebody were to purchase from Subway down or the 5 houses across the street or into the bank. Because that's the only way that would work. If you had to tear all that to go to this 150.
So again, the 5 houses are in the supporting subzone.
Yeah, sorry, just this side of the street.
Correct.
Which someone did
You also
purchase.
have the historic overlay.
And then you have the historic overlay as well. But again, if you wanted to, we'll have a very different discussion if this number gets reduced in terms of those other areas. But in downtown, reducing this maximum building width is immaterial in the core.
I mean, I think 185 is long, but 150 is
I'm just not sure if that number matters.
That's what I mean, I think 100 feet I'd be comfortable with. I'm just not sure it matters. But technically what happened at One Island was somebody bought all the buildings and did do that. So,
but that won't happen again. All the restrictions are.
So let's just for the town center, for downtown, do you want to stick with the 150 or do you want to do something less?
I prefer 100.
I think 150 works because the one block that probably has the most potential is the bank block, basically.
That's a sub-district.
So you're talking about for
You know, the
US Bank?
West Banco?
So that's in that area too?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's also different. That'd be 100. It's not 150 wide, it's 150 deep.
No, it's probably, what is it?
It's 150.
150 wide.
150 wide. So then we can potentially get another one.
Again, you won't get One Highland because it'll be short, it'll be not as wide, and you do have additional standards that you didn't have that.
I don't see any issue with 150.
I like 100.
Why 100?
I just don't want to pack any more into it than we already have.
Where's that number come from?
From the One Highland building.
No, where's 100 come from?
I just think that it's a restriction. It's just, I think it sets back 50 feet reduction in it. That's all. Just shortens it, allows less for the.
What's an average store frontage?
30 feet.
How's everybody else doing? I think we got 2, 1, Andy, Jeff, Eric.
I mean, in my mind, I was thinking, a building that would allow for a width of like, say, 3 to 4 stores, then a separate structure that kind of breaks it up. But, so, you need, if it's 30 feet, just to get 3, 90 and 90, and there's some break in between, so you're talking about needing 200 feet, or something like that, plus offsets, really, that doesn't allow for it.
Right.
It could be 75, it could be 200. I think it shouldn't matter because there's not the opportunity to do anything like that in the CBD.
In the town center.
Yeah, towns of yes.
I agree, I don't think there's an opportunity to use 150.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to leave it that way. Okay.
This is 150 lots.
And to be clear, as we continue to have discussions and digest that, and see some stuff change, we have.
You have plenty of time.
Can we get some examples? Could we do that?
So as I said, just to give you a frame of reference, this building is 167 feet wide. So if you stand at the street and look, and then the building behind West Bank is 137
I'm
feet.
talking like examples you did for the ship place, how dense it can be, what can you have there?
Oh.
We get that.
Sure. Again, so we're talking about two separate things here. We're talking about the bulk of the building versus the intensity of the building. Because what we did at Safe Shift was more about intensity than it was bulk.
Which I would like the intensity, not just the size, but also like the intensity, because I think that's all. Because I'm talking about, when I always talk about density and intensity.
So and we said that what we would bring back in June was we would just sort of look at the existing buildings that are out there and talk about the amount of square footage that's there, what that means. So we will have those numbers when we come back.
We'll have what the intensity could be,
In terms of square footage, we will have some understanding of the intensity when we come back in June.
And just to be clear, in the supporting district, the width is 75.
Correct. And the supporting district is Masonic all the way to Forest. It is the building that we're sitting in. It's Guardian Bank and the convenient area. What's the other bank? US Bank. All of a sudden the banks went on my head. And the post office.
All 75.
All 75.
So why wouldn't the, like, where convenient is, why isn't that part of?
I'm sorry, what is it?
Where convenient is listed as the TCX.
So we had the discussion back in June of last year. A lot of what you see is orange, in terms of where the banks are and the convenient mart, all of that was core. And then the discussions, I understood it, was that you wanted to start some transitions. And so that was why those became supported.
Is our park, is the sitting area next to Ameristop for convenient and the West Bank building underneath the S, is that supporting or is that?
That's core.
That's not owned by the city though.
But it's not owned by the city.
Correct.
And so we had to give it some zoning.
So I don't like it, what color is it?
It's pink, so it's in the core. It's in the core. So West Banco and that clock tower, the whole frontage is core. And that's what Eric was saying is 150 feet.
Yeah, that's the only real spot that could.
Potentially end up there.
The CBD could go back a little further than what you have.
I'm sorry?
The TCS starts, I guess, right at the back of West Bank.
It does. And it's a very odd property line, but that is where it starts. That is one of the few places where we are intentionally dividing a parcel in the zoning line. Would you like to see the convenience mart be something else?
It just seems like that the central business district should go back a little bit farther, because that property would seem like the center of town.
So do you see the,
I just don't know why it's not one color one way or the other.
because,
It's not one zone.
so
There's
there's
to go back farther towards,
toward Hagedorn.
yeah.
So if you see the line, the sort of the smaller parcel in the parcel,
That's owned by West Bank, isn't it?
it is, but we could move the core line back to that point. You see what-
All the way across.
Was this a recommendation from the plan?
Above the D, it's in the TCR.
Yes, like above the D in the CBD TCR, we could move the paint back to there.
What are you thinking, Andy? Why do you want it to go back further?
Well, it just seems like that whole building, that, I'm just guessing, but right here, in that area, should be same kind of core zone as this.
What restrictions does it have by having two different zones? It seems like it's just unusual on the page on the side of the owners.
So again, it was the idea that as you are transitioning back toward Miller and Lumley, it becomes less intense.
Oh, just like go down there.
Correct, correct, correct. But certainly the
Because you're
line
going
could
into a
move.
residential neighborhood behind there.
Correct.
So it lowers the height, setbacks, everything like that.
Reduces the maximum building width, moves the building back on the lot, can't be at the street, it has to have a 25-foot front setback, those kinds of things. We certainly can move the line. Do you want me to bring a map showing that on the 19th?
Yeah, I'd be interested to talk about.
Yeah, I have a question to the heck of it too. Is the parking lot into America South, is it here, the road, is it right here or is it here?
Under the rain. Yeah, I think it's that whole area right there.
It's right on the left side of that little box.
So then explain short of what's the box? You said that's part of West Bango?
No.
That, where Andy's drawing is a part of West Banco, that's their actual legal lot. That is, as I said, this is one of the.
The spots on the right as you pull into the park.
They own the spots too, Mayor, for their convenience as well.
Oh, there? Interesting. Yeah, I would think.
At least the majority of it.
I would think you'd have that all the way back to Hagedorn.
And when we came, we originally had it all the way back to Hagedorn. And the discussion,
Planning and zoning suggested.
well, it was the discussion that they had with y'all back in June of a year ago, to start that transition. So, but I'll bring the map on the 19th that shows the parcel line and moves the core line back, to basically that line that West Banco owns.
Because the estimate's a little bit more restrictive of what you can put there, so.
Yes.
If you're gonna move the line, I need to move it all the way back to Hagedorn or at least through the existing building.
Okay.
Because that line, that West Banco owns only goes to the strip portion of that building and not the addition. I'm looking at the GIS here. Yeah. So,
So bring a map showing.
I know that our current zoning, the houses across on Miller and Lumley are both considered in the central business district, because my daughter bought one of those houses years ago, and in order to add a deck, she had to go through a whole bunch of ramifications because she was in a commercial zone.
Right.
And that has been changed. That in itself has created more of a buffer between the residential.
Well, they're still in the central business district, they're just in the residential subzone. So we did not move them into a residential zone, we made them into the residential subzone.
Gotcha.
But yes, I'll bring the map back showing the line moved back to the end of the convenience mart.
Which will be all inclusive of West Banco and partially inclusive of the convenience.
And will that create problems for Thomas Ave? Wouldn't it make more sense to just go back to
It will make it more difficult to redevelop that parcel, to have it split zones, yes.
I think that should be adopted next week.
Okay.
But by expanding that pink, it makes it more possible to build a larger parcel, larger building.
It does, it's gonna make it much more intense, because, it's gonna open all of that up to the core.
Yeah.
So,
By doing this, you restricted the size of the building that you go there, but we're basically asking for the opposite of what we've been trying to do with everything else. That's expanding that. So I like it as is.
all right, well, we'll bring it up on the 19th, and we'll, and what I think we'll also do is show like where a potential building could be based on these two scenarios, like, because for example, it would have to be 25 feet setback from Miller under this scenario, otherwise it could be right at the street.
Yeah.
So,
I agree with Jeff. I think that that's the intensity we're not looking for. And then I actually like the fact that you subdivided it so it softens it way down to a subdivision that's actually pretty packed and already it's pretty tight. I see why it's not makes sense, but I don't know if that's what we're trying to accomplish.
all right. Okay. So we're going to leave as I understood it, we're going to leave the 185, the 150 for the maximum building width.
I personally like 100. I think we can discuss that with the combination of
I'm okay with 150. I mean, if somebody wants to reduce it, we can have a conversation, but I'm not comfortable just saying 100 because.
Yeah, I just think the conversation we had the planning, we had the meeting. Yeah, that's what I think, yeah.
All right. So another change to the specific development standards in the Phase 4 draft is, and we've talked about this to a certain extent already, the minimum front setback for the supporting area was changed from 20 to 25 feet. And then to give you a frame of reference, from Shone to Forest Avenue, the range of setbacks is everything from 17 feet to 76 feet. And then to let you know what 26 feet, what 25 feet looks like, the building that we're sitting in, the city building, is sitting at 26 feet. So by making that change, it just ensures that the buildings are going to be set back about the same amount as the city building is today. Any concerns with that change?
What's the current setback of those houses?
So from Shone to Forest Avenue, the setback range is from 17 feet to 76 feet.
How about those right there? Those all.
So some of them, the shortest one is 17 feet, and then some of the other ones are further back.
Okay.
And the reason that there's such a huge variation in the setback in that area is because the road takes the turn, and then when you get to Fifth Third Bank, they have the parking in front. But 25 feet is where the planning commission felt comfortable with. So that was a change that was made from Phase 3 to Phase 4. The final change to the...
Real quick, I just, when it comes to the curve, if there's curve, that's the only place that would really affect, isn't it, there? And then in front of the Ameristop, I guess, the curves, because that's kind of a weird line, right? When you have a curve, right, all the houses are kind of parallel with each other, right? And then the curve is the only thing that extends the frontage, right? So would it be weird to have that curve and not have them all lined up?
So again, it's a minimum setback. It's not a maximum setback. So,
That makes sense.
okay. So the final change to the development standards from Phase 3 to Phase 4 is in the Phase 3 draft. It was possible if a building was set back, the upper stories of it were set back, it could exceed the height by 10 feet. That was changed, and so that provision is no longer permissible in the town center core and the town center supporting. So you can no longer have the upper stories set back, stepped back, and exceed the maximum height.
Is that a property for Thomas?
No, it is not. It was just a picture that was in the zoning ordinance showing what a step back means, because that's not a term that we use very often. And so what we're saying is the upper floor is stepped back. But there was some concern about exceeding the maximum height, and so that was eliminated from Phase 3 to Phase 4. So that is no longer in the UDO. We've already talked about this. So the other issue in terms of use is the issue of allowing bed and breakfasts, particularly in this area. Some community members have talked about how valuable these homes are. And would it be more likely that they would continue to be residential in nature if we had other types of uses that were permitted, such as a bed and breakfast? So what is your thoughts on allowing a bed and breakfast within the supporting subzone?
Would that be the same as an Airbnb or short-term rental, or B&B is its own thing?
It's its own thing. It has a separate definition.
What is the definition?
So it's basically a hotel where they serve food at breakfast. That's essentially what it is.
But the owner doesn't have to live there.
Well, you can make that, and that is a very common standard, is that the owner has to live there. Or within close proximity.
Does our current zoning not cover that issue?
Bed and breakfasts aren't allowed in your current zoning at all.
We just changed something to allow that? Allow Airbnbs.
So Airbnb.
How is Airbnb different from a bed and breakfast?
So a bed and breakfast is more in terms of the whole thing being used residentially. And then you could make it such that the owner has to reside there, which is very different than a short-term rental. But we're going to be talking about short-term rental where we're making it that. So in some cases, if you had that as a restriction, they would be very similar.
But it's still a question, but in a bed and breakfast, in my experience, versus an Airbnb, somebody has to live in a bed and breakfast to cook breakfast.
Correct. But keep in mind, we're going to talk about short-term rental in a minute, where the planning commission made it a responsibility, say that the short-term rental has to have owner occupancy. So because of that change, it would be very similar, yes.
So this is not allowed now, why is it being brought up?
Because again, community members have said, we value those homes because of the aesthetic nature that they bring to that portion of town center. So therefore, what can we do to make them continue to be used in a residential way? Give them another use. So that was the idea behind allowing road and breakfast.
How can we maintain the structures, but improve them to improve the values of the street?
What would be the argument against allowing it?
Every time I just want to, when I think of a bed and breakfast, I think of a quaint downtown city, something on a river. It's very, I personally like them, you know what I mean? So I just don't, I have to, I know I need to know more, but I don't know the disadvantages to allowing. Because you can't have a lot in there, right? 2-3 rooms. It wouldn't be rented all the time, just during big seasons. I just don't know. Anybody else think the same thing? I mean, I don't.
Maybe I'm not very, maybe I'm not seeing a downside to it.
I don't see a downside either.
Is there a known downside you're aware of?
If we have good restrictions, no.
Like owner occupied?
Yeah, things to restrict owner occupied is a possibility. I'm not myself, just for research I've done over the years for Airbnb, I'm not too concerned about that one. But definitely parking, off-street parking, you know, that's where you get the most complaints is you've got a house that has, you know, if it's a larger house, you have 4 people that are staying there with 4 different cars. And that's where we get that's where the city gets the most complaints is having too many cars on the street. So as long as you state that has to have enough parking for the occupants, off-street parking, that's really, for me, that's the biggest thing that I'm concerned about. And limiting it, you know, to 29 days or less type of thing, just to keep it not
You know, my concern with Airbnb was off-street parking. Those places, people try to pack as many people in as possible for these events.
Right.
Those existing buildings have sufficient off-street parking already.
They do.
That's pretty average, so I say let's move on.
Okay, so let's do it, and I'll bring back some restrictions. How's that? All right. Because I agree with Matt, the issue is definitely parking. So. Anything else on downtown before we move on? So now we're going to move on to Midway. So there are actually 5 subzoning districts in the Midway, 3 cores and 2 residential. The core zoning sub-districts differ by both uses and development standards. The residential subzoning districts differ by permitted uses, with the more intense non-residential uses being allowed in the residential 1 subzoning district. So let's look at the map. The core 1 is the aqua color, with the rust color being the core 2. Core 3 is the olive green, and that is the Cincinnati Bell building. The fluorescent green parcels are the residential 2 subzoning districts, and the lilac parcels, which are predominantly the lots along Midway Court, and the shotgun houses on South Fort Thomas. There is a terminated view where River Road dead ends into South Fort Thomas Avenue, and then there's also the red line for required occupied space for Core 1. Any questions about the map? I will point out to you that the lot that is at the end of Midway Court today is zoned R1A and will continue to be zoned R1A after this is over, which is why that is on the map. But the rest of the parcels are in the residential subzoning district.
Just real quick, so for quick reference, Cincinnati Bell building,
Yep.
then Grassroots and Vine. Then is this the American top here, or is this the American top here?
I was so bad.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I can't see.
Here, let me go to this side. I just want to make sure I'm clear. Where's the American top in this? Is this the that's? That's the American top, right? Then that's what ends this district here.
No, it ends at Bass.
Okay.
It ends at Best Furniture.
And this is okay. Like again, this is a post maybe, or is that?
No, the post is up there.
Okay. Showing the framework.
So at Brentwood, it's that home that's an office.
Oh, okay,
That's the home that's an office now, like attorneys.
All right.
All right. Are we all oriented on the map? Because all the discussions that we're about to have are relevant to this map.
What's on the other side of the street between Shawnee and River Road? Is it MR? You have a fluorescent green, and you have something more east or south of that. Right above the M. MR2.
Oh, yeah, the CD.
No, up.
One more.
One more down.
Yeah.
Here, right there.
Okay, so the fluorescent green?
Very well done.
Looks like you got
There you go, man.
You build the fluorescent in as a buffer, right? Think of from the CBD, or essentially a buffer, and then what is beyond that? Looks like there's another red parcel that's beyond.
I think it's just that our map line is very thick.
Yes, okay, well, that's exactly right.
Because it also exists, like,
Yeah.
it also exists like right there.
And if we want to change that line weight, we certainly can do that.
No,
But that's what that is. And again, the PDF of this is much more helpful than this. And then once this actually becomes law, it will be given to PDS for them to put on the online version as well. So you'll have a paper map, you'll have a PDF map, and then you'll have the online version with PDS.
is there a reason we don't have the fluorescent green on all terminating spots of MC2? Working back into the neighborhood?
Right. So for the lots that are currently have homes on them that are not on Midway Court or Fort Thomas, they are fluorescent green. So the idea that the Planning Commission had, again, was we wanted to make those homes conforming. So if there's a home on the lot, it then becomes fluorescent green with one exception. And that is the Kaufman property on River Road. So we had his business, his duplex, triplex that is there, and then his home was fluorescent green, and he asked for it all to be the same. But other than that one spot, everywhere that is today in the central business district along those side streets that has a home on it is in the fluorescent green.
Which originally was in the business district, and now we're reclassifying it.
It is still technically in the business district.
Right, but it's being reclassified,
But it's-
where it wasn't before.
But it is now a residential subzone, and they are allowed to have limited amounts of non-residential uses.
Okay.
And that is why there are two residential subzones, is because in the shotgun houses on South Fort Thomas and then along Midway Court, there is no restriction on the amount of the house that can be used as a non-residential use for like an artist studio or that kind of thing. But there is a restriction along those side streets. So the Midway Court, which is what you see here, the height that was included in the phase 3 for that was 50 feet. The Planning Commission pulled it back to 40. The building that is there is approximately 34 feet in height. So again, we're very consciously making that building non-conforming. And the reason that happened is because, as you know, it has a huge front setback. And so at some point in time, something was built in front of it, the Planning Commission did not want it to be 50 feet. That's why that happened. Any concern with that?
Can we zone those guys out of here so we can?
I don't think we can do that. So,
Just computers and.
yeah.
Trucks come in and out of the bit, but I don't know.
Building is this big and this much space.
Back in the day, they needed all that, right? They don't need that much technology anymore. Do they do a lot of storage there now? Is that what they do? You might know.
Whatever, they still run utilities out of it. The flagpole itself is a cell tower.
Oh, is it really? I didn't know that. I'm glad they put a flag on it.
So we may want to continue this discussion to June 19th, but like in Town Center, we were having the discussion about limiting the number of stories. So just to give you a frame of reference, there are several 3-story buildings in Midway, such as the ones that you see on the screen. The Kaufman building is the one that is 2.5 stories. And to give you a frame of reference, the building with the turret is about 43 feet tall, not including the turret. And to the top of the turret is about 55 feet. So we again would be, if you, by reducing the height to 40 feet, you are making at least one of these buildings non-conforming. And if you limit the height to 2 to 2.5 stories, they then become non-conforming in that as well.
With like the turret, because I think it gives it a lot of character, would that be like would that be something that would qualify for that,
Administrative modification. I mean, it certainly could be that, you know, I'm not real worried about the turret. I just want
No,
you to be.
I think it gives a lot of character. Is that something that if they wanted to build something like that, would that qualify for that 4 feet difference? I'm just curious.
It potentially could. It potentially could, yes. But just know that by, you know, the restrictions that we're putting on the lots, you are restricting the creativity that can happen in some cases. Like no one is going to propose, if a new building comes in, that they have something architecturally significant like that on the corner if it's going to dramatically increase the height, because they're not going to want to fight that battle.
Are we allowing any other uses that are there to be in any of these zones?
So let's, wait just a second, talk about use right now. Do we want to continue the discussion about maximum number of stories now, or do we want to just move on to something else and have that discussion with the planning commission?
I think we all,
Okay, so we'll just continue that. Okay.
well, we did discuss like the 2.5 stories. Did we the rest of the stuff?
I think if I misunderstood, please tell me, but I think that was a discussion you wanted to continue to have with the planning commission. Okay.
How tall is the red, the red 3-story that's in the forefront?
So the one in the forefront is about 42 feet. Yeah.
I should know that, obviously know this, but
You said that's over 50.
the red is the pub, the red's not the pub.
Red is the top.
The red is the pub.
Yes.
And then 4 times feet is the top.
Excuse me, 55, sorry.
Because the top of the curtain on the lines.
No, I'm talking about, I thought you were talking about the one that's in the foreground is above 40 feet, it's about 42, 43. And then one with the turret, the top of the turret, at least from online sources, about 55 feet. Yeah. I think that was about 45. The one in the foreground. But again, this is all just from online sources. So we've already made the choice that all of those buildings are non-conforming by reducing the height to 40 feet.
But if that, say, for some reason, one of those planners was good, could they still build back up?
They could, as long as they do it within 60 days, within 6 months, and didn't do it intentionally.
That's not great. Is that a good amount?
That's what I was just thinking, the 6 months, is that something we restrict or is that something beyond us? Because
That's your current standard.
is that enough time for them to
It's just they have to just start construction. They don't have to finish it. They just have to get the permit within 6 months.
This is a permit, that's not even like presenting plans, just saying we want to do this and then. I'm gonna agree with you, I don't know much about it, but to try to redesign something that I probably won't have plans for in 6 months, they just have to apply for permits, they can get the permit.
The other thing though, if you do make that longer, then you start delaying, because of my last city, we had a building burned down, and that was 4 years ago, Mark, and it's still sitting as rubble on the main drag.
Right, I see what you're saying.
So you need to motivate people, especially on the main drag.
At least they're trying, at least I think you won't turn them down as long as they're making efforts to try to leave the time.
Anybody have a problem with just in here, even creating a new column with everything except the height different and allowing that to be 50 feet right there? I mean, it's 55 or not, or just to allow it, or not just, but allow 3 stories like it is, just right there.
Just for that one building?
Just for those 2 buildings?
Just for MC1 is just those couple little buildings right there, right?
And C1 is fast up to.
Yes.
Up to Grants Roads.
Right, so it's everything. Now, we could, I mean, if you would like to allow those to be 50 feet and 3 stories, we can find a way to do it between now and the 19th.
I'm just curious, like they are 3 stories. they're more than 55 feet.
Right.
It doesn't look bad.
No.
But again, that's a historic, right?
Yeah, those are all the historic districts, yeah.
Everything that's.
No, I mean, having MC1 its own column, which allows it to be three stories.
Just for those two buildings, right?
Just, well, not the, I mean, the MC1, so it's a couple buildings there.
It's grassroots.
So like if Best was torn down, you could build a 50-story building, is what you're saying. You could build it.
50 story?
Like high rise. You could build a 3-story building. You could build one just like that.
From there all the way down to Best Furniture?
I don't, I'm just opening it up for discussion.
I mean, right now we brought it down to 40 feet, right? That's what
Yep, 40 feet.
the conversation is, right? So the 2.5 stories is kind of in the general consensus, what we're going to go back and talk about.
Right.
We also have 50 feet, then that would make an entire line of buildings that could be.
What I'm suggesting is not have the blanket as it is now.
Right.
Where you carve out, is it okay right there to have 3 stories? That's what I'm.
So if from there, from the pub down to Best.
Just what is called MC1.
Yeah, so from the pub to the, I think I understand what you're saying. From the pub down to Best, carve that out to where they can all be similar in shape and size.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But not the whole entire MC1.
Well, that's, the MC1 is only that little strip.
The MC1's all the way down to grassroots.
It's all the way down to Grassroots and Vine.
Right.
So that's
still a little
lot
strip.
more. That's-
Yeah, but if you want 50 foot.
How tall is the building next to the Midway?
Yeah, I mean, it's just opening up for discussion. There are 3-story
That's on
buildings.
there.
There's a big difference between the topography. It's the existing one.
Right.
And
I think we leave it at 40 feet, what it is personally, and
Well, is 40 feet gonna, like you mentioned earlier, say that's, that maybe it's what's wide, or that's a different kind of.
It's not on both sides of the street.
Right.
Well, keep in mind, it's not going to be on both sides of the street because you got the hospital across the street, which is in R1C.
Yeah.
So it's still only going to be one side of the street.
Right.
what did the planning commission suggest here?
Well, the planning commission was looking at, they were okay with 40 feet. They punted the issue of stories.
So 40 feet is what they recommended.
I will tell you that they got there in the end. I'm not going to say that they were comfortable with it.
What if we needed 45, but then you have this, 10%?
But again, the 10% is not a given. There has to be something that is,
Yeah, but then
that is unique to the property in order for Mark and Kevin to do that.
Right.
But what I hear Andy saying is at least from Midway Court to Best Furniture,
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
that it would be 45 or 50 feet, 3 stories. Which is a very,
How tall is the building next to Midway, the cruising building?
That's what I was wondering.
the one that's residential?
Yeah, probably.
It's between 40 and 50
Yeah.
peak.
Because it's got that nice big, this one.
Yeah, it's 3 stories.
No, it's 2.
It's 2.
It's 2.
But it's a
Possibly
high 2.
Yeah, possibly 2.5.
Yeah, it's definitely 2.5.
Oh, yeah, for the ones on the side. Yeah.
Yeah, so for consistency purposes, Andy's making a good point. At least from Midway Court down to the Best building. Because you don't want to have a 50-foot building next to Midway, because that just wouldn't look right.
Oh, I see.
Okay, not going anywhere. They just remodeled the grassroots line.
All right, so why don't we figure out a way to do that? And if I'm hearing correctly, it's from Midway Court to Best Furniture, but not from Midway Court to Grassroots and Vine. 50 feet, 3 stories. How's that?
Yeah.
Okay.
That does exclude the cruising building, right? Because the cruising building is north of Midway Court.
I don't see a problem doing that whole side that way. I don't think anybody's going to do that, but
Yeah.
it matches the existing.
There is a difference from what Andy's saying, though. There is a difference between Midway Court to Best and Midway to Grassroots because of the trees and everything on the side. It's more contained. It definitely opens up there, which probably allows the 50-foot is not big of a deal, which why it doesn't feel so
I
compact.
don't want the slot behind you.
But if it next to Midway, a 50-foot would probably be a lot just because of the trees and stuff. So I get that. Just when you drive down there, look on Google, you can kind of
Okay.
there is a different feel right there.
Yeah, I would suggest everybody drive down there and take a good look at it now before you, film on the wall.
Well, it'd be.
Those buildings are all very unique. It might seem like we want that, but they seem unique now, and all of a sudden, eventually, if you take them down and put up the wall, it's gonna look very different. You know what I mean? Like, it's just not gonna be the same look that we have now driving through that area.
But don't forget, I mean, you're in the historic district.
Yeah. You wouldn't be building something smaller than what's there.
Right.
All right, so what I'm hearing is from Midway Court to Grassroots and Vine, 40 feet, 2.5 stories, but we'll have a conversation with the Planning Commission. And from Midway Court to Best Furniture, 3 stories, 50 feet.
I mean, I think we should talk about it.
We will talk, but that's proposal in front of the Planning Commission. Okay.
What's the height of the MR2? Is that what's across the street there when you get down toward Best?
So MR2, I'm sorry, did you say MR2 or Core 2?
I think it's MR2, the brown area that would be kind of across from Best and the buildings that are north of it.
Okay, so that's 40 feet.
That's the post, and
That's-
that little single story next to it.
And it's the South Side Market, it's the office building, it's, the vet, yeah. And truthfully, as you're heading out of town, further south, I don't think you want to think about the MC2 becoming 50 feet.
No, I was just wondering what the.
It's 40 feet.
That's a nice transition the way it is right now. It's goes from the residential into the school. It's a nice look.
Right, just the center part.
I think all the areas right now have a nice transition. I don't know, just coming out of the denser business areas.
So again, we're talking about the maximum building width, and the Planning Commission reduced the maximum building width. Because again, this column applies to the traditional building, traditional business district, the town center, the Midway core. So it was reduced from 185 feet to 150 feet. Do we want to just continue that discussion with the Planning Commission in June?
I think what I look at here is the CBD MC2, which is where the Ameris, is that the Ameris? I think that's the Ameristop, and that's the 2 buildings there. What is the one? Logistics company. The other one. It says 0 minimum setback on those. That's quite a change from the Ameristop and the buildings that are there now. So the Ameristop sits, the only one that sits up front is as far as I remember, is the barber shop, the salon, the vet, and then the Ameristop is set back pretty far. The logistics building is probably 15 feet back. And then the building next to it's got a parking lot in front set pretty far back. If we take away minimum setback in that area, it really is gonna box in that entire area, especially considering if you consider across the street, posts on the sidewalk, and even those narrow homes that are there do not have a large setback, so there's a really box that area in the minimum setback.
Really nice buildings back up.
Yeah, that building is back up. Those lots are not particularly deep.
Okay.
And it
There's
would
not
be,
pretty far back there, so it's the other ones.
and it would be, you would want to be constrained. Let's think about that you might want those parcels to redevelop in the future. And by further constraining them, you make redevelopment more difficult. This might be a time where you want to think about maximum building depth again, but I don't know that you want to place a minimum setback in those locations and further constrain redevelopment.
And also restricting that there's no, if the bodega was to redevelop, it would not be permitted to put parking in the front.
This is such an odd task for us because we talk about protecting and then we talk about redevelopment all in the same, under the same umbrella, right? So where's the balance? And if we keep using redevelopment as a tool to get us not to protect what we have, then we are not doing our jobs correctly. And I'm not sure that we want to consider redeveloping it in a way that doesn't fit what we want. That's my take on it, you know what I mean? So like we just seem to use it when we need to because we're worried about what it's going to sell for, but in the value of the property to somebody when I'm concerned with more the value to the entire city.
How are you not doing your job though if you're not considering possibly.
I'm saying there has to be, there has to be a happy medium.
Pendulum's got to go back.
It does, and I think we're doing that, and we're trying to meet in the middle as much as possible, but putting all those buildings up with a zero setback is not, it's completely changing something that's completely different than what we have now, you know, versus the other areas we're kind of meeting in the middle. And it allows for higher intensity, higher density. I don't know what the uses are yet because we haven't gotten to them yet, but if the uses are apartments or residential, stuff like that, it's going to be intense. My take.
I don't want to be completely stagnant, but also I think there's other safeguards that we are, it's hard to talk about all at one time because you still have to think, we got the historical preservation, we have the, the other committees that are going to be working hand in hand with this too, where hopefully, they're going to help protect what's there, but also not, it's not just this, I think there's some safeguards.
Yeah, I think we are the first line of defense when it comes to protection.
Sure.
You know.
So we're proposing that the.
I want to know what the uses are going to be, what the permitted uses are. We haven't gotten to that.
You're talking about MR2?
I'm talking about CD and C2.
The core two.
And C2.
Yeah. So in terms of the difference in uses, the major difference between the core and the core 1 and the core 2 is that within the core 2, you are allowed to have multifamily, which is not allowed in the core 1. And that is the major difference in terms of uses.
And that's current.
No, that's as this is currently drafted.
So currently drafted, we're adding multifamily into those areas.
Correct.
So it's not permitted now, but we're going to add multifamily.
So what you have currently right now in the central business district is you do not allow residential on the first floor, but you allow residential on top of non-residential.
Okay.
So the major difference between that and now is that there would then be permitted to have multifamilies, that you would have residential on the first floor only in the core 2, not in the core 1. The core 1 is that traditional area. So that's a major difference. And then the defining difference between the core 1 and the core 2 is this multifamily.
So I just think I've stood pretty strong in my feelings about more multifamilies in town, and I'm strongly against allowing more multifamilies in general from top to bottom.
Looking into it, did you say MC1 would be as proposed, not non-residential?
So in MC1, you would be allowed to have, you must have a non-residential use on the first floor, and then you could have residential or office or whatever else you want above it.
So like the Cruzy building could be rebuilt in a similar use?
No, in the core it could not, because
That's what I'm getting at. So we're actually, in the proposal, we're taking away that density, using the Cruzy building as an example, because that's currently
it's
in
multifamily.
fact, it's all multifamily, yeah. But are you saying that would not be a permitted use
It would not be a permitted use in the core 1.
in the core 1, but in MC2 it would? So it's a
In
give
MC2
and take in that regard.
I think the size of the area and the fact that they can rebuild it, they rebuild it just like it is currently, right? So if something happens to it, they could rebuild it like it is.
In terms of again, let's separate non-conforming structure and non-conforming use. The Cruzy building today is a non-conforming use, and it will be a non-conforming use in the future if this UDO is developed, because the first floor is being used residential. If it is a non-conforming use, it could not necessarily be reestablished if more than 60% of the replacement value or the fair market value is destroyed. And that's the difference between a non-conforming use and a non-conforming structure. So in that particular case, their structure is conforming both today and under the UDO, but the use is non-conforming both today and under the UDO.
And that building is probably 75 feet wide, where this is 200 feet.
And I don't know how
That's
wide it is.
that's a lot of space there.
But again, the primary difference between the core 1 and the core 2 is this multifamily.
I think the number one thing we get from the entire community over and over again, density, you added intensity. They were worried about that on 27 when we talked about buying the single family homes and allowing those lots to join to make more multifamily houses. And now,
So here's what I'm going to tell you.
Reposition that to this area, and I don't think that's what people want, or what our city can afford to have with school systems.
So I'm going to tell you this. The reason that you are struggling with some of those spaces being occupied is because currently you require there to be a non-residential use on the first floor. you can't support as a community all of the things that are zoned central business district as non-residential uses completely. You just can't. You don't have the density of population for all of that to be usable uses. So because of that, the multifamily becomes a permitted use in the core two. You certainly can change that. That's your prerogative. But as we talked about with the Guardian Bank or US Bank, what ends up on those sites in terms of uses may not be what you desire. Yes, the building will be in the same place and there'll be parking in the front and all of those things. But the more you restrict those parcels, both with use and with development standards, you may end up with uses, I'm not saying you will, but you may end up with uses that are less than desirable and certainly are not going to be high value retail.
Yeah, so that's what, therein lies the balance, right? Because if we had density, we could potentially affect the school system, which hurts our value. And I've said this from the very beginning, that our population is not quite what it needs to be in order to support every business we have in town, right? So it's a weird system we have, a weird ecosystem we have here. So where's that correct balance, right? And I think one of the things we do to help with the businesses is that we have been doing is redoing the park, adding the pickleball to the middle of town, even adding a little skate park to Highland Park, and then redoing the rec center, which we gave a lot of money to, which is going to drive regional needs to us. And that's going to drive the traffic that would hopefully support the businesses, but you got to be very careful on the densities that affects the school system. So,
And you keep saying that, since 1980, we've increased 1.08% of population. So I just don't think, and then what decision we made in 2012, we haven't seen any kind of bust. So I know you keep saying that, and we know, we've talked to Brian, he's explained to us that we have capacity.
so
So I just don't,
We don't have the
keep
numbers.
saying that, but I don't think that that's a huge thing.
We can only build the school system, we built all 4 schools in the last 10 years, and you can only build the school system as large as it can go at the current population. So when we built the school system, we do whatever you can to try to maximize some of the rooms for added growth, but we had to build the school systems at our current population. Multifamily homes in that kind of area today have 50 families.
Right, and that's not what we're talking about.
Well, that's we're talking about those places being apartments. And then you've already added the stuff on Newman, you know what I mean, which is another, 25 homes and possible developments in other places. So these things do add up, And then you also talk about mother-in-law suites as well, too.
What if we,
That could change, hold on, let me finish. That could change the amount of density we have if you allow mother-in-law suites. So these things do add up over time. And I think it's our responsibility to make sure we don't.
1.08% in the last 35 years.
Adam, what if we talk about, if you take the MC2 from the VA to Shawnee and make that where it's got to be commercial underneath, and any of the current MC2 from Shawnee down, allow that to have residential. That's all both sides?
So what did you say our growth rate was?
And restricted in size in comparison to MC1, but we still require, like MC1, the commercial on the first floor. But then if you move down past Shawnee, allow residential on the first floor.
So south of Shawnee, in the MC2, you could have the multifamilies. North of Shawnee, not.
Yeah, like, what would that look like?
You're saying to have commercial on the first and then residential on the second?
Yeah, like it is in MC1, only with
more restrictions.
There's more restriction height.
Yeah, and then on both
And then coming
west and
further.
east sides of South Fort Thomas, from Shawnee down, or Maristop down, you're saying allow the multifamily there?
Allow residential there.
And so the site that has
See, we're
the
not-
south side
we're not
on
talking
it.
about, 100 units. We're not even talking about 50 units, probably.
Yeah. So where south side is,
We're not even talking about not even 20.
Are you putting south side in, allowing multifamily or not? Because that's slightly north of Shawnee.
You know, either way, I guess.
Okay.
I feel like the feeling is more.
Is it where, where
Right.
south side is?
Right.
I agree.
Yeah. To make that also much more critical.
I mean, this would just be a good topic to have with planning and zoning. Obviously, this is what they have drawn here. What was their, did they all agree with this, or was there discussion?
So the thought process was knowing how difficult it is to have that requirement of having non-residential on the first floor and how difficult that is for redevelopment to happen, that they would only require that in the traditional core area, which is where you basically see that red line. And then where there was a chance for redevelopment that was outside that core, that they would allow multifamily in that location. So like where the south side is and where that office building is and all of that. I don't think that they were hard and fast about where that line was drawn. It was, we definitely don't want to change the character of the core area. We'll definitely require non-residential there. But like I said, I don't think they're particularly hard and fast about where that line was drawn.
And the old ice house, that's still part of the historical?
Yes, it is. Yeah. Everything that is, because of the way the historic district is constructed, anything zoned central business district, even those homes that are along Shawnee and Brentwood, are actually in the historic district. Believe it or not. And one on Grandview and all of that. So yes, all of it is within the historic district.
To Andy's point, can we look at that with, parking and everything you would need in that space there? And if you had residential on the first floor, how many units, would you say 20? I mean, what are we talking about?
Well, you're looking at, if you look at that, where, I guess, is it Story and the old medical building, there's an alley there. You can't build over that alley, right?
No.
So if you look at rear and side setbacks, there's not a huge building that would go there, but somebody can build a 6-unit place.
Right, and because of the alley, they could put parking to the back. They would have, be able to put parking underneath and all of that. But because of all the parking requirements and all the other things, you're not going to get much there.
Right.
In terms of units. You just won't.
And then what about where the convenience is? But it's just north of, kind of even north of Shawnee?
Again, you don't have a whole lot of parcel depth, so you're not going to get many units.
I like where you're mentioning there, and then across the street, and then across where Kaufman is having commercial on the bottom of those buildings.
Right.
Instead of all residential like it's.
But basically and I apologize that we have a misspelling on the map because it says alley instead of alley. So basically everything from Shawnee south would be where you would allow it, but where the south side is, you would not. Okay. We'll redraw the map.
I don't know, I just think we could do better than what's there.
Okay.
I want to go back to population. I mean, we used 1.04%, so we said. I'm looking at this, from 1980, we had 16,000 people. In 2022, we had 17,310. We had a boom in 1970, 16,338. So from 1980 to now, we have over 1,300 more people in our town. And 30 students per school is a lot. So I think we need to be relative on what the 1.04% is, because it's a lot more than I think people think it is. You can say it sounds like a small percentage, but it's an actual number. And 20, 30, 50, 100 students is a significant change in our school system. So I don't think the number, the percentage can be.
That's over 44 years, though.
That's in
So
the last.
how's that growing?
Well, in the last year, we've grown 0.4%, from 2021 to 2021 to 2022. Do you know what I mean? So in the last 20 years, we've grown almost 900 students, 900 people. So I think that's more significant than people think it is.
All right, so what we'll do in June is we'll come up with a different map that shows, as you're talking about, Andy, where it might be appropriate to have that multifamily. That will not include those parcels north of Shawnee. So we'll come back with that and have that discussion with the Planning Commission. All right. So like all the other non-residential districts, typical non-residential uses are permitted, restaurants, offices, and retail. Drive-throughs are completely prohibited within the core subzoning districts. And then, just like in the other ones, we'll remove hotels in the next edition of the Phase 3 draft. We did not discuss maximum building width. I'm assuming that's just something, a topic we want to talk about with the Planning Commission. Okay. Anything else we want to talk about with Midway before we move on? All right, so at this point, we're going to turn to the Fort Thomas Avenue Overlay District and look at those corner parcels to determine if they should be included in the overlay district. So again, this is not a historic district, it's just the overlay design district, and with the intent that we really are protecting that residential character along Fort Thomas Avenue. To give you a quick refresher, it overlays parcels that are zoned R1A, R1B, and R1C, and includes those R3 parcels that are occupied either with single-family or two-family or residential care facilities. And again, what's being governed is all new construction and substantial renovations, which is defined as anything to the front of the home. All right, so as we discussed last month, the boundaries of the overlay district were discussed by the Planning Commission during both phases 2 and 3, and they ultimately starting on the north end at Covert Run and going down to Mount Pleasant. In that area, we have one corner lot that we need to look at, and it's located at 10 Barrett Drive. The view of the top slide that you see is the view of the home from Barrett Drive. The bottom is what you see from Fort Thomas Avenue. So the question becomes, and this is sort of how we're going to do this discussion, if it's okay with you. I mean, do you want this lot to be in the overlay district?
Are you going to go each lot individually for the?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And so the idea that, and the reason this came up, just to give you a little bit of context, is right now they're not in the district, because the idea being that they were fronting on those side streets. And someone said, well, what if they add a porch, or they decide to, put solar panels on the side of their house or whatever else? That could change the character in these particular areas.
I don't see
Yeah,
it.
I brought it up, I think, but it's so what you're trying to do is to create a certain look.
Maintain a look, not create a look.
Maintain a certain look from the view of the avenue.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And to me, whether that house is facing one way or the other, it's still part of the avenue frontage. So my question was, why exclude?
I agree with them.
So I mean, we certainly can just, as a blanket, so let's do this. Let's run through all of them. And then at the end, we'll say, yes, include them all, based on that. Does that work? Okay. So we're going from Mount Pleasant down to Cliffview. And there is one parcel here. The view on the top is what you see from the avenue. The view on the bottom is what you see on Southgate.
That one's definitely even more so, would change the look of it because of the fence in the front porch.
But again, the front porch is not facing the avenue. The front porch is
side porches, I'm sorry. The side porch is too large.
But, it already has a detached garage that's accessed from North Fort Thomas.
Yeah.
It's the old country club clubhouse, I think.
Did they improve it?
No, it's just where it was. That's it.
That's cool.
There's 9 holes right there in the entrance.
I know that. That's cool.
Then the avenue, the overlay district goes from Heartwood down to the city building, skips downtown. And this is 439 South Fort Thomas Avenue. The photo with the garage is on Indiana Avenue. The photo on the left without the garage faces Fort Thomas Avenue. I actually don't know where the front of this house is. I probably shouldn't have said that.
I like the look of the house though.
The overlay district picks back up at Chalafonte Place. It goes down to Bivouac. South of downtown, the first corner lot is 2 Manor Lane. What you see on the left is facing Manor Lane, and what you see on the right is facing South Fort Thomas. The second one is 2 Glenwood Avenue. The photo on the left is the facade facing Glenwood Avenue, and on the right is South Fort Thomas.
It's got 2 entrances, it's just the address.
On South Fort Thomas, the district goes from Bivouac to Cincinnati Bell. And the district continues south of the Midway area and terminates at 27. And then the final corner lot is 8 Grandview. The top view is what you see from South Fort Thomas, and the bottom is the front along Grandview. So now that you've seen those homes, you can make a blanket statement that they all need to be in, and we'll add them to the map. Or are there any that you want to exclude?
That would be the only one I would even consider, but I think a blanket for the most part. That's how I feel about it.
Put them in? Okay.
I think it simplifies things. And if anybody wanted to buy one of the lots that got fairly expensive and they had to rebuild, it would be subject to that.
I see.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Matt. Before you step you put Lauren's email address on all this.
Sorry, do you have just,
Okay.
what's, because there's a couple that I'm like, oh, go either way, but the downside to not including them is.
So, with the exception of probably this one, because the topography is such that
Yeah.
it's clearly facing the other street. It's set back a long distance from South Fort Thomas. The downside would be like for some of the ones that are further north, if they tore the house down and reoriented it to face, to face Fort Thomas Avenue. If it was not in the district, then it could be very different.
But for them right now, if they want to build an addition on, is that going to make it, it's going to make it more difficult for them?
It's only at this point what will happen is they will have 2 fronts.
Okay.
And they will be then governed by what they will then be in the overlay district and have to be, comply with those standards.
There's not a way to grandfather them in now and then make that to where if someone did tear it down, then it would be.
So all new construction, if you put it in the district, would then have to be complied.
Right.
But there would be no way to say, I guess we could say, we could put an asterisk or something on the map and say, these parcels only have to comply if a new home is constructed. And we could do that.
Would that be, do you think, I don't know, legally that?
But, no, legally it's fine, but to Adam's point, if they just decided to cover the entire side of their house with solar panels,
Right.
then it doesn't meet that goal.
Okay.
So there is an avenue for them, if we do blanket it, there is an avenue that if the zoning administrator, if Mark or Kevin, if it's not meeting the standards, they can go to, it's the design.
It's a design review board.
Yeah, so they could create something that they could do like a row of trees or a hedgerow, like something to make it feel like it's on the avenue and still put their row of solar panels on the side of the
So we
house.
could do something like that where it kind of gives them.
Right, I mean, the way this is currently structured, if they meet the standards, they get a building permit, no big deal. But if something happens and they want to, as Frank rightly said, if they did want to put, solar panels on the side of the building because that's the only place they could put it because of the angle of the sun, they could go to the design review board. The design review board could say, we'll allow you to do this if you place, X number of arborvitae, X number of feet from the house and maintain them in perpetuity. So that you're not seeing, a whole side of the house in solar panels. So that is their option. They are not in a situation where they can't do something.
So that's the definition of the equivalency provision, right?
No. So the equivalency provision is solely for the planning commission and solely as a way to meet the standard in a different way. This is actually a deviation or a modification that is within the scope of the Design Review Board's new responsibilities. And keep in mind that the reason that we're doing this is that safety valve, right? Again, we don't know every single solitary parcel and every single solitary house up and down the entire avenue. So we have to give them the ability to ask for relief, have a safety valve.
I think this is one of the best things that come out of this right here is protecting what people really want. They still have an avenue for change. You know what I mean?
So this continues down to Alexander Quay.
Yep, it terminates at Alexander.
And there's no issues down
No.
I mean, it's only affects 4 homes, though, right?
Oh, I didn't count them, but
No, I mean, four homes that were not conform or not.
that weren't in the district, like 4 or 5, I don't remember. All right, we're moving on to Article 5. So we are at 11:30. Article 5 is the article that deals with all the regulations that are applicable to all districts. So Article 5 includes all of those, but we're only going to cover select topics in 2 sections. Section 5.1, which is the section that includes the standards for temporary and accessory uses, and Section 5.7, which are the sign regulations. So Section 5.1 pulls together, as I said, those temporary and accessory use standards, and we're only going to talk about short-term rentals. So the city's existing regulations for short-term rentals were established in 2021, just so that we're all talking about the same thing. A short-term rental is like Airbnb or VRBO. The definition that you see on the screen is what was created in 21, and it defines it as an accessory used by guests for less than 20 consecutive days in a year, and it has to be subordinate to the dwelling unit. However, the definition does not specify whether it's permissible to rent a room, to rent an entire dwelling. And so at the time that this was passed, there were also other regulations that were put in place that we'll talk about in just a second. Based on the Planning Commission's discussions in March, the definition has been modified somewhat to handle all the situations where short-term rentals are to be permitted based on the Planning Commission's definition. So that's the draft definition that you see on the screen. So based on the Planning Commission's discussions, short-term rentals are permitted as accessory uses in the R1, the R2, the traditional business district, and all of the central business district subzoning districts that allow residential. So for example, those homes on Miller and Lumley. Short-term rentals are prohibited in the Alexandria Pike mixed-use district as well as in the neighborhood commercial office district, and they're prohibited in the 2 multifamily districts. And these were very deliberate discussions by the Planning Commission about what was appropriate, for example, to allow short-term rentals in multifamily. So the only thing that we're going to be talking about here is the R1, the R2, the traditional business district, and then the central business district.
Do we have a map that shows? Go back one. R3 and R5.
So R3 is, all of those multifamilies that you see running up and down Fort Thomas Avenue. Those are zoned R3, to give you a frame of reference. The large multifamily that you have are R5.
Okay.
But again, short-term rentals are prohibited in all of those, based on the Planning Commission's discussions. Much of your existing regulations that you passed back in 21 remain in the UDO with some minor tweaks to account for the consistent use of terms. These regulations require an annual license, the payment of occupational taxes, and inspection by the building inspector.
Go back to the last one. I'm sorry, I went to the last sentence.
So this is in your current standard. If you had decided that bed and breakfasts were not going to be permitted, then I would have pulled this out, but you're going to permit them, so that will stay. And the reason this is in there is because they do have their own separate building code issues, and I'm sure Mark can talk more about, but that is why it was originally placed in the regulations in 21. So the Planning Commission added several regulations, including, as we alluded to earlier, in the R1 and the R2 zoning districts, in the residential and supporting subzoning districts in the CBD. If you have a short-term rental the owner has to be in the home when it's being used as a short-term rental.
So that's current.
No,
That's what they want to change it to.
correct.
We discussed that originally, and I thought it was supposed to be in there, it was not. So they're saying that if you have a Airbnb, they have to live there.
So if you use a
Or it has to be
bedroom,
their main company.
yes, it has to be owner occupied. It cannot be, for example, an income property that you solely use as an Airbnb.
And they're suggesting this change.
Correct.
I like it.
In terms of a two-family, one unit in the two-family has to be occupied by the owner at the time, or the licensee at the time that it's being used as a short-term rental.
Have there been any issues that the city's experienced since we've had?
Yes.
Does this address those issues?
Has there been any issues, or has this addressed issues we've had?
So when this says, can you explain the subordinate? It's got to be subordinate, right? It's there's another term there you add.
Accessory and subordinate.
Accessory and subordinate. Can you explain that?
So basically it means, so for example, if you had a 3-bedroom home, you could rent out one of your 3 bedrooms and it would still be used primarily as a dwelling unit, but you could use it as an accessory use by renting one of your bedrooms.
So
And then-
different than like, I think Bellevue does it where it's like you have to live there 6 months out of the year, you can rent out, so it's not that.
No,
Okay.
no, they actually, we did talk about that, but no, it has to be owner occupied, or in the case of like a 2-family, you know,
You can rent out the back. Okay.
So that the owner has to be on site.
has to be on site anytime that is being used as a short-term rental.
Yeah, so that definitely prohibits a lot of our issues, but it also drastically reduces the ability to use that as revenue. So just
I think when this was originally brought
the
up, it was
balance.
a woman that was renting out one apartment in her house, and she wasn't legal, and she was there as a resident.
Right. Yeah, the only issue we have are the 2 that I can remember in the last year, ones that the owner doesn't live there.
Are
So
they
it
grandfathered
becomes,
in?
No,
that's it's not required right now.
Okay.
So that's the only issue, is just from noise and things like that, where people are renting out and there's nobody there to kind of monitor that, so the police end up having to monitor that. So this would fix that, and then, of course, the parking.
Has that been an issue?
The parking has been an issue, just because we've had short-term rentals in properties that are not allowed to have short-term rentals because they don't have driveways. But no, for the city's aspect, this drastically reduces the ability for people to use it, just so everybody knows that, but it does take care of all the issues that we have.
So I live in the house and I have to be in the house at the same time, is what you said. Like if I go to Europe for a month, I can't.
correct.
So what some people would do is they'll rent their house out, and while it's being rented out, they'll stay at their parents' house or a friend's house, or even get a hotel because they're still making more money than that. So that's what they can't do here. So even people that have that as their primary residence, they can't rent it out and then go somewhere else for a short time. This would require, so if we get a call and a complaint and the PD gets there and the owner's not there, then that's a violation.
So it turns everything into a B&B.
What's this?
Well, no, because again, an Airbnb is predominantly a transient use, all for the whole.
So bed and breakfasts.
Yes, excuse me, a bed and breakfast is a transient use because the whole thing is being used by people who are coming and going. In this particular situation, it has to be accessory. So as I said, like 1 bedroom out of 3 can be rented out, but not all 3 of them, because then it becomes a primary use of the property, not an accessory use of the property. That's the difference between the 2.
But ever talked about going away for a month, make it a week, somebody goes on vacation, we're not saying that suddenly is a problem.
They have to be.
They have to be on site while it's rented.
While it's rented.
They just can't rent it that week.
Okay.
Not now.
They could,
Not now. Now they're able
Recommended
to.
change is to make,
Yep, they have to
and
be on.
that's strictly because people are abusing.
Yeah, is this recommendation Matt, is this your recommendation?
It is not.
History or?
I mean, it wasn't, this change was not my recommendation. I'm just explaining from my experience with the city, my last city, the issues that we have. This does, although it limits the ability for residents to get to use it and to get revenue. So you are limiting their property. However, it does take care of the biggest issues we have, which is people leaving and not monitoring their own property and having issues with
And
it.
what this also does too is it allows us to have more residents, because there's a lot of people that inherit homes, they might want to turn into an Airbnb because there's some debt on it.
Right.
So then they either keep it, rent it out to one family, or sell it to another family. So it would also open up that more for,
Yeah, it would.
you know what I mean? There's a small bonus to doing it this way as well too, which is I think we're trying to balance that.
Is the fee per day?
No. You mean for the city?
It says you're subject to a $500 fee if you violate,
A violation, yes.
and that's per day.
It would be per day. Per violation.
If you rent it per month.
It'd be per violation. Yeah, so I mean, it definitely needs, that's
So what about if we,
enough of a fine to make it
Per day.
per day.
what about if we allow, we start out not requiring them to be there, and upon a violation of any sort, they get one opportunity before they lose the license. And then they have to stay on site. If there's an issue, police issue, somebody calls and they have to be on site. And if they're not on site, if something else happens, then they lose the license.
Well, the challenge there, and Tim, you can jump in, but the challenge there would be that somebody bought this property for that purpose, and they have one unruly group, or even two a year, and we strip that right from them. I think that's a challenge, because they bought the property for that purpose. This way, they can't buy that property for that purpose.
And these things are constant problems with cities. When I was saying, hey, can you go away on vacation, I certainly wasn't intimating you should be able to, because they're difficult, they're a problem. And I think the residency requirements are paramount.
I think it's all good, and it does limit the amount of Airbnbs that are possible in town, which is good. And I mean, I'm just thinking of myself as an example. I've got 3 bedrooms, but if I were gonna rent one to, God forbid, Adam.
We agree on that.
You can share in the bathroom, which is, so it really limits the amount of opportunities for this, which I think is probably a good thing, based on everything I've heard.
I think the limited amount of parking we have in town, and shared driveways, everything else like that, which I hear is an issue for most cities. And they have to, everybody thinks about it at first, they open it up and they end up closing it back off. Proximity to downtown makes it very appealing to as well, I think, so I think it helps eliminate that for the current residents we already have.
So we're good with those.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I would rather have you stay with me than me with you.
We're also, if there's any change, so you have to get a yearly license. If there's any change in ownership, your license becomes null and void and you have to get a new one. And right now you do have a parking requirement for your short-term rentals, but we are just adding it in black and white that anyone who's occupying a short-term rental is prohibited from parking on the street. And that may be difficult to administer, but at least it's there if the police department needs it. Unlike with the other non-residential districts, the short-term rentals would be permitted in the central business district and the traditional business district in those core areas. If the gross floor area of all dwelling units used as short-term rentals is less than 50% of the gross floor area for the building. The Planning Commission had a very long conversation about whether or not to allow short-term rentals within these places that have residential over non-residential. And ultimately came down that they were comfortable with it in these 2 places as long as it was somewhat managed. And this was the concession that they felt the most comfortable with. Do you have any concerns with this approach?
I have a question. Why the CBD and TBD and not in the Midway? Is it just because of not opportunities in the Midway?
I know the CBD is Midway.
Oh, it's Midway. I'm sorry, that's right. Yeah.
I know it's confusing. Yeah.
I think you're opening yourself up to more of the trouble you're talking about there than in residential house. Because you're going to have nobody that really has that much. It's a short-term rental.
Mm-hmm.
So nobody's going to be anywhere near the site. And then is it the same thing? So if there's 2 problems, you're out for the whole building or just that one unit?
Well, that's not a stipulation
That's not a standard now.
of having violations and we withdraw it. I have not had any issues with this. And I don't know if that's because, 50% of it is long-term rentals. I don't know if it's just because it's not a house, so you don't have that many people. It's more of for me, it just fits better to do it in these areas because it is a business area. You won't have the noise complaints because it'd be essentially like above the pub, right? So I don't know the answer of why I don't get complaints and why I feel like this does make the most sense, even more so than a house. Just because these are, it's an extra revenue source.
If the property is subject to 2 or more substantiated civil and/or criminal complaints, the zoning administrator may revoke the approval.
And that's the current standard, yeah.
Okay.
Is that fair?
All right.
That was back in 21, yeah.
But historically, what, like say over the pub, have they been short-term rentals?
We've got one, in the Midway District, we have one area, it's, I'm trying to think of the building name. It used to be where the old truck was parked out in front of it. And that's the one that has 2 short-term rentals in it. It has 4 units upstairs, and then you have the leasable space downstairs. They have 2 short-term rental units. It meets the regulation there, 50% gross floor area, so it's less than half of the space, and he saved a lot with it in speaking with the owner.
And they're very nice.
I guess if you have residents living there, they're kind of policing it.
And I think that's what it is, and that's why because I've been to that one, and it's super nice. It's been very effective. It's a great revenue source for him. He's got long-term and short-term. He can mix it up. I think it's more that the long-term people are policing it. There are smaller units, so you can't rent a whole house to have a house party. It's really business people that are coming in for town and leaving. So, like I said, I'm sure there's you guys can bring up other things. I feel like this fits best, even better than residential, because it just kind of works there.
The long-term guys kind of act as owner-occupier.
Yeah.
Essentially, I think, and again, I have nothing to back that up, but I feel like that's how it works.
And I would point out that it says he may revoke it, he doesn't have to.
Yeah. I have long-term people policing long-term people.
Yeah. That's what that is.
All right, any concerns with this approach? All right. Anything else we want to talk about in terms of short-term rentals or other accessory uses? All right, believe it or not, this is the final topic, signs.
Saving us for life.
Oh, yes. So the sign regulations of all the changes that we have made are some of the most considerable within the UDO. And basically that's because we had to align the sign regulations with Reed versus the town of Gilbert, which was a 2015 Supreme Court case that required all sign regulations to be content neutral. We're not going to go through all of the signs, we're just going to do a couple of topics. So one of the major changes that we made is that all ground signs are prohibited in the R3 district, which again are those multifamilies that run up and down Fort Thomas Avenue. These are existing signs that are out there. And so in some cases, I think the horse is already out of the barn, but there won't be any new ones if this is passed.
So this will remain though?
This will remain. The regulation, we're moving on to digital signs. The regulations for digital signs in the residential zoning districts were enacted in 2017. The city's institutional uses, whether it's schools or churches, are almost exclusively zoned in a residential zoning district within the city. So keep that in the back of your mind that all of these institutions are within residential zoning districts. When the regulations were adopted in 2017, electronic signs were permitted for public and parochial schools only, that's it. And the current zoning ordinance defines parochial schools as an institution or a place for instruction or education belonging to and maintained by a religious organization. Also in the back of your mind, keep in mind that public schools are exempt from zoning. So no matter what we decide, they can do what they want to do.
Did you say, is that for the Catholic schools, or you said religious organizations?
Those are parochial.
So those are parochial, and currently they are allowed to have a digital sign.
But we can make it work.
I'm fine with that.
Have you gotten complaints about those owners?
I don't get those. I don't know, Mark, do you guys get any complaints?
I think when the St. Thomas sign went up, it was that just initial reaction to it. I got one complaint. It's kind of like a street light that gets changed, where they react to it because it's bright and new, and
Yeah.
but after that,
And these do get turned off, which I didn't even realize till a few months ago. But I mean, Warriors is like, at night is grindingly like, wow, this thing is really bright, but it does get turned off, so I guess that helps. I didn't really know that.
I just think they're a great way for our schools, even the city, to get information to as well.
Well, if we just get one complaint, we got restricted. Sorry, long meeting, I'm getting slapped.
That one, I think it was when it was first on. Right, but it's serious.
So let's take a second to tell you what your existing regulations are for digital signs in residential districts. You have a limitation of 40 square feet per side or 10 feet in height for a monument sign. They do have to be turned off between 6 a.m. They're only allowed to operate between 6 a.m. and 11 p.m. They can't glare onto residential properties. They have to be set 5 feet from all property lines. Any malfunctions have to be cured within 24 hours. Only 75% of the permitted area may be digital. They have a hold time limitation of 10 seconds within movement. The brightness is also regulated, and the display interval must be 3 seconds or less. So these are your existing regulations. During phase 3, the Planning Commission decided to prohibit electronic signs in residential districts. So essentially, the one sign that is currently there, which is at St. Thomas, would then become non-conforming.
Are they saying they want to keep that so that like St. Catherine's could get run? Is that what you're saying?
So essentially, we are closing the door,
With the exception to public schools.
with the exception of public schools, which can do what they want.
St. Catherine's the only one.
or public entities, the library.
The library, the schools, health department.
Post office.
Yeah, post
So the
office.
only one that this affects kind of is St. Catherine's? YMCA already has one, right?
Yes, but they are partially in a non-residential district and will be fully in a non-residential district in the new code. But in terms of the schools,
Everybody has one with St. Catherine's.
I don't know.
Thomas has one, Moyer has one, Woodville, and
Yes.
Well, there's some small churches that are maybe classified as educational, is why I think they were worried about some of the churches that have maybe a school in the basement, like the Wise Owl on the corner of Avenel.
Top of Grand Street.
Top of Grant, some other ones that it could be classified as a school that
those
they.
are in tighter communities too.
I'm sorry?
What do you think? What do you think? I mean, 6 to 11 p.m. is late, right? You know what I mean? And the technology advances, the brighter they get, the clarity is up on.
And I have a question too, just in full transparency at least, because last time I talked to you about this, I know it doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal, but it's actually it's a pretty big decision to make.
It's a huge decision.
And I was under the impression that Planning Commission kind of punted this to us. They settled on a prohibition.
They did. They had long conversations about it. There was one commissioner who thought they provided lots of information. There were other planning commissioners who were more ambivalent, and then there were some that were adamantly opposed to all digital signs and were offended that the schools were going to have them or could have them. Ultimately, they decided to prohibit them.
I'm kind of used to them now, so I don't know. But
Yeah, I think if you think about going down in front of, you see one at St. Thomas, you can see one at the Episcopal Church, you can see one
Christchurch. You can
I
see
think
what
about
here, at least, I mean, that changes the whole avenue.
the church's
Just-
thing is the thing that
I look at it.
one school within the church, you're right, it's a lot.
It could become a lot,
And that was the concern. It could become a lot.
which I don't love in residential areas.
I agree.
And not all of them are. I mean, the Avenue in and of itself is not a residential neighborhood in the same way that.
That's true.
But
But it's.
it is your spine. I mean, you value it so much that we have created this overlay district. And to suddenly create the overlay district and then
Yeah.
have all these digital signs, it seems to be a little bit contradictory.
Do these regulations prohibit, I don't see it right here, prohibit like having a movie or a commercial rolling. Like, I see where it says it has to change
So-
20 seconds, but I don't want it to have like commercials and rolling things like.
So right now, they're prohibited completely. I mean, as it's currently drafted, they wouldn't be allowed to have any. Those are your existing regulations.
These are existing. So the proposed regulation would not allow running a movie.
Wouldn't allow them at all.
Okay.
So suddenly you,
Oh, okay.
they would be completely prohibited with the exception of the schools, and then St. Thomas would be allowed to keep theirs.
So we can't regulate that the school can't have a sign, they can have the sign, but we can't regulate how the regulations you just showed, that doesn't apply to them either?
Correct. Now, my understanding has been that they are good stewards, and that if you have and if I'm misspeaking.
Right. Nope, you're correct.
You know, that they are good stewards, and if you have regulations, they will abide by them, which is why they turn it off at 11 p.m. But strictly speaking, they are exempt from zoning, and as Kevin said, and that includes the library and the post office and all of those other types of public institutions.
I think you said it, I think Maureen had a great idea. You stated well about the area of town where it would turn into something, and I think we're doing a lot to protect those areas. I think it would be a mistake.
No, I agree, and the only thing that concerns me a little bit, if we pass this prohibition, which I think I'm in favor of, from a legal standpoint, what happens when one of the other churches or St. Catherine, for example, comes and says, and of course this has never happened, or hasn't happened to date, which is interesting, but if 2 years from now, St. Catherine wants a digital sign, and we say, well, no, I'm sorry, those are prohibited per our zoning ordinances, and they say, well, look at St. Thomas. How does that work?
So basically,
Gotten in earlier.
That's exactly.
They still have an opportunity. I mean, this also may trigger people for the next 2 months to quickly do it.
That's exactly what I'm thinking. Before we actually pass this, people might jump all over it, but, I mean, legally speaking, that's not a concern though. Okay. So,
because it's just like anything else. I mean, you can make things conforming or non-conforming all day long.
right.
So Lauren's point, I mean, that is, sorry, that is the same avenue of discussion that the planning commission went down. It was like, yes, these are fine, and then bringing up what Lauren brought up. I mean, that's exactly that.
I'm just looking at the, we thought essentially that we 10 signs all the time.
Yes, and we actually had a graphic that showed them all the potential locations it could be, and it was easily 10.
Right now, they'd have to have a pretty strong case of what kind of school they would operate, or even get the permit to get one at this particular time, right? As well.
No,
Well, there was
Oh, they
one
would not?
gentleman that
I'm just saying that your definition, the reason I read you the parochial school definitions is that it is very loose.
Okay.
So, you know, as Kevin said, the person who's operating the kindergarten in their church might be able to be classified as a parochial school and get a digital sign before this passes. And I'm sorry, Tim, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, but you're exactly right, and because the gentleman out on 27 came in, he was making an argument for it. I will kind of deal with that in a different way.
I think by doing this, you know, there might be another 2, 3, 4 you get over time, but it keeps it from being an explosion where the, you know.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm in favor of it.
All right, we're prohibiting them.
Prohibition is.
Okay, so like electronic message centers or digital signs, there was quite a bit of discussion by the Planning Commission regarding murals in both phases 2 and 3. In phase 3, the Planning Commission decided to prohibit murals. For a little bit of context, in the phase 3 draft, we did have some standards for murals that were applicable in the central business district only. In that situation, the murals couldn't exceed the height or width of the building. They couldn't project more than 6 inches from the wall. They couldn't block windows and doors and other building openings. They couldn't have electrical or mechanical components. They couldn't cover or destroy any distinctive elements of the building. And they couldn't produce a light intensity greater than 3 foot candles. And they had to be maintained.
So this is out, is what you're saying.
So do you have any concerns with this prohibition against murals? I mean, if you did want to consider them, we could make them conditional uses and have defined regulations. But in the draft that you currently have, murals are prohibited. Any concerns with this prohibition or any desires to investigate allowing them conditionally?
Are they allowed anywhere? Are they allowed the CBD?
So we don't know how the one that's there got there, but they are not expressly allowed in your current ordinance.
So the other opportunity and what we've discussed as a staff and is probably my recommendation is to allow it as conditional use in CBD area. So that would force them to apply, show what they're proposing. You know, it's one of those things that we can't dictate what it says, but when you make a conditional use, I talked to a few muralists just to see how that works in other cities because of, can they just do anything they want? When you make it a conditional use, they do, provide what they're going to do. And even though we can't regulate that, we could also just say it doesn't work, right? So it's one of those things. I'm not big on completely prohibiting it, but if we do it conditional, it does give us an opportunity to review it before it gets approved.
I personally like some of the murals we have in town. I think they are great accent pieces. The walls didn't necessarily have a point before it, like the one in the parking lot down there. It brightness to an area, the Fort Thomas one on the side. I mean, I don't understand limiting I don't want to cause any drama. Right. You know what I mean? So can we limit it to based on Fort Thomas, or is there a way to do it?
You can't limit what it's going to show.
Okay.
However, talking to the muralist, if you do the conditional, then that's a way for you to essentially at least see what they're going to be putting up to see if it fits.
But you can't, are you getting into sort of a freedom of speech kind of thing?
I'm worried about
you don't
that.
like the message and it has to go up anywhere, we're in trouble. Then
They would have to follow whatever conditional uses and we with this.
Right, we'll have standards, and that's, sort of why I read you some of the standards that we have. We can have those, we can add additional things to them. It will have 2 levels of review in the central business district, which is one of the other reasons that I think Matt talked about limiting it there, because it would go both to the design review board as well as to the board of adjustment, because it's a conditional use. It does give you a fair amount of oversight. And then keep in mind that we will define it as a conditional use and put it in your accessory use regulations and treat it that way versus a sign. Because we do not want to be dealing with all of the implications of trying to regulate it as a sign. So we do have a fair amount of leeway if we treat it in a way that Matt is talking about. If you would like, I can bring, we can have a discussion again with the Planning Commission about potentially what some of those standards are. They were just concerned about the message and all the things that could potentially happen, and felt it was better to close the door than to open all of those things up.
And I haven't thought of that much since then, because I kind of thought the door was closed. I love a lot of murals, but as counsel, I start to sweat when I think about trying to fight off some guy's mural, lady's mural that has a message that's offensive or.
And that was my initial concern, because that's what I do for liability. But I went all extreme. What if they did this? What if they did this? But the more I've talked to a couple muralists that do a lot of them around here, it doesn't happen, because the building owner's not going to allow it. These muralists don't really want to make statements, because it just becomes controversy, and they're building their business on doing good murals, things like that. So for my initial thought, where I like to just say no, because it limits my liability. The more I've researched this, I don't think that is a true concern. I think that's a huge one-off. And even if you look around, Covington and some of the other cities that do have some nice murals, you're not going to have really crazy ones.
I haven't seen
I'll meet with Matt and I'll research.
And those are the cities that just don't have those 2 levels of regulation. It's just do it, right? So if that's
I think a lot of time the buildings owner want to reflect what they do, what the city is like, too, and the people around it. Can we limit it to make sure that the muralists are licensed and insured, so that would keep a little bit of freedom? Sometimes people are free reign.
They would have to, I assume they would have to have an occupational license.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, you know what I mean? Because I would agree with you that the ones that are doing this for a living are probably the ones that are less likely to.
You're right.
Do them. I mean, so I'm just thinking of how we can tighten it as much as possible.
Is the phrase
I can look at that.
community standard something that can be used at all?
No, again, yeah.
I like that.
But there might be some license.
Yeah, I just, I don't know, just things of, what does everybody think about it?
I don't have any issue at all with this prohibition, this conditional use terminology you mentioned.
Okay.
I think they really add value to some of these buildings that are, you know,
I love it.
for the city. Yeah.
All right, so why don't I think our discussions with June 19th are going to be long. I'm not sure we're going to get through it, but I will, bring you some draft conditions for this as well on the 19th. How's that?
I remember there was, real quick, on the old movie theater building, there was they were asked to build like an old style theater marquee. Yeah, like I think that would be really cool. Was that not allowed?
It's not allowed in the sign regulations, no.
And in your example, could you do one where it's as strict as we could go and still be reasonable? I'm concerned about how do we know who owns the building at some point in the future? Who's the person that wants to put up, local messaging? We don't have complete control over it, and so does that make sense? Like,
yes. Yeah.
How much can we actually control and still make sense to actually have? I don't know.
Is there like a layer two for like a historical standpoint on what, like would that not, you could prove that the color you want on the building is not.
Yeah, they would have to go in front of the design review board.
Okay, so that's all three then.
Yeah, they would have to go in front of the design. So it would be two levels of review. It would be both the design review board and the board of adjustment, because the board of adjustment does conditional uses. Anything else about signs? All right, so we will, as we've said a dozen times, we'll be back together on June 19th to meet with the Planning Commission at their regular meeting. In terms of the process for next steps, as you see on the screen, the process for adoption is there, and we have some tentative dates. Again, I say tentative. The first step is the Planning Commission sets the public hearing for the UDO at their meeting on the 19th, and right now the public hearing is set for July 31st. The Planning Commission holds their public hearing on the 31st and provides a recommendation to City Council. They have to hold a public hearing, and they have to provide a recommendation that is required by KRS 100. And then the council has the first reading of the ordinance to adopt the UDO on August 19th. And then the date for the second reading and adoption has not been set at this time. So.
And those dates are all subject to change.
They're all tentative, yeah. But that just gives you an idea of sort of what the process looks like, even if the dates change. The Planning Commission has to set the public hearing, there have to be mailed notices, they have to hold a public hearing. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I look forward to talking with you on the 19th.
2 minutes before 12.
Thank you for everybody.
Thank you.
Sure.